In the cold vastness between stars where legends are forged and broken across centuries, there endured a warrior whose name would echo through the ages, though not for glory alone. Demetrian Titus rose from humble soil to command the Ultramarines' finest warriors, yet triumph became betrayal, and righteousness became curse. Stripped of identity and exiled to the Death Watch, he learned that redemption exists not in vindication, but in acceptance of uncertainty. His journey, from legendary captain through terrible trials to eternal service, reveals that true heroism emerges not from unwavering faith, but from perseverance despite fundamental doubt itself. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, let's ease into tonight's journey together. Chapter 1. The Agri-World Child. The red sun of Tarentus hung like a blood-stained coin in the amber sky, casting long shadows across the endless sprawls of grain fields that stretched toward the horizon. Demetrian Titus felt the heat upon his shoulders as he worked the soil with his bare hands, his fingers pressing deep into the rust-coloured earth. The soil of Tarentus was unforgiving, resistant to cultivation, yet the farming folk of this agri-world coaxed their subsistence from it through sheer determination and accumulated knowledge passed down through generations. These shadows of the towering grain stalks moved across the fields like the fingers of some vast primordial beast, grasping at the rows of crops as though eager to claim them back. Around him, the work continued without pause, his father and elder brothers moving through their assigned sections with the methodical precision of those born to this labour. The agri-world demanded obedience to its rhythms, and the Titus family, like countless others, had learned to bow to its relentless requirements. Demetrian was different, though he couldn't entirely name the feeling that set him apart. Where his brothers moved with competent familiarity, he moved with something hungrier. His body, already taller and more heavily muscled than others his age, seemed to contain a restless energy that the endless fields could never quite sate. He could lift loads that required two of his brothers working in tandem, could work through the brutal midday heat without faltering, could push his physical form beyond what the other youths considered possible. His father, Primaris Titus, often watched him with eyes that mixed pride and something darker, a recognition, perhaps, that his younger son was not destined for this red soil. Demetrian, his father called across the field, his voice carrying that particular weathered quality that came from decades of shouting over the wind and machinery. "Come! Rest before the evening work begins." The compound where the Titus family lived was modest by any measure. A cluster of stone buildings arranged around a central courtyard where repairs were conducted and tools were maintained. The main dwelling was simple, its walls thick enough to withstand both the extremes of Tarentus' seasons and the occasional dust storms that swept across the plains with little warning. Inside, the air was cooler, carrying the familiar scents of cooking grains and dried herbs that his mother cultivated in clay pots. His mother, Lyra, stood at the window overlooking the fields, her movements economical and purposeful as they always were. She possessed a clarity of mind that showed in every gesture, every carefully measured action. When she looked at Demetrian, there was recognition, not of a son destined to follow in his father's footsteps, but of something rare, something that agri-world life could never properly contain. "You push too hard," she said, offering him water drawn from the deep wells beneath their compound. The water was cool and clean, a luxury on Tarentus. "The fields will still be there tomorrow." "The fields will always be there," Demetrian replied, his young voice already carrying a depth that seemed at odds with his youth. "That's what troubles me." Marius emerged from the courtyard, his weathered face creasing into lines of concern. He had worked this land his entire life, as his father before him and his father before that. Generation upon generation had laboured beneath the red sun, and it seemed only natural that the cycle would continue. Yet he recognised in his youngest son the same hunger he had experienced in his own youth, a hunger that the soil of Tarentus could never truly feed. 3 weeks later, the selection arrived. The Sky Lords, as they were whispered about in the farming communities of Tarentus, came from above on landing craft that fell from the heavens like meteors halted mid-descent. Their armour was dark and imposing, ceramite plating that bore the Imperial Aquila and the heraldry of the Ultramarines chapter. Where they walked, even in their massive powered suits, the earth seemed to settle more firmly beneath them, as though acknowledging the presence of something far greater than mortal man. The chief selector was called Sergeant Valorian, and he carried himself with the quiet authority of one who had seen 10,000 battles. His weathered face was a map of scars, each one a testament to survival in a galaxy infinitely more hostile than the carefully tended fields of Tarentus. When he surveyed the gathered youths from the 3 farming compounds nearest the landing site, his eyes, one a piercing grey, the other a pale milky white, seemed to look through them rather than at them, evaluating something that existed beyond the physical form. "Strength alone is meaningless," Valorian announced, his voice carrying the resonance of one accustomed to command. "The Emperor requires warriors who possess not merely the capacity to endure, but the will to triumph when all reasonable hope has been exhausted. Reach for the rope." A thick cord had been suspended between 2 metal poles driven into the red earth. The task was simple: climb the rope to the top. The selection had begun. One by one, the youths attempted the task. Some climbed halfway before their grip failed. Others managed 3/4 of the way before fatigue overwhelmed them, and they fell back to the earth. A few achieved the summit, but their efforts were laboured, their triumph incomplete. Valorian watched each attempt with those strange, penetrating eyes, and Demetrian understood in that moment that he was witnessing something far more significant than a mere physical test. The sergeant was reading something in each youth, some essential quality that the rope would either reveal or conceal. When Demetrian's turn came, he approached the rope without hesitation. He had not yet reached his full height, yet his body was already dense with muscle. His hands, calloused from farm work, gripped the rope with instinctive certainty. He pulled himself upward in smooth, continuous motion, not rushing, not stopping to rest, simply ascending with the inexorable determination of something that could not be denied. He reached the summit in half the time it had taken any other youth, and when he descended he was not breathing hard. Valorian nodded, and something that might have been satisfaction crossed his scarred face. That evening Demetrian stood before his family in the compound courtyard as Sergeant Valorian presented the Emperor's benediction. The words were ancient and formal, weighted with the authority of the Imperium itself. Demetrian was being selected for the scout company of the Ultramarines chapter. He would be transported to the fortress of Hera on Macraga, where his transformation from human to warrior would begin in earnest. His mother held his hand briefly, her grip strong despite her slight frame. His father embraced him with a firmness that conveyed both pride and finality. His brothers regarded him with something that mixed admiration with incomprehension. He was leaving the fields, leaving Tarentus, leaving the world that had shaped his body if never his spirit. As Demetrian ascended the boarding ramp of the transport craft, the red sun of Tarentus hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to reach after him. He did not look back. The hunger that had never been satisfied by soil and harvest would finally find its proper outlet. Somewhere ahead, in the void between stars, his true purpose awaited. The Agri-World child was stepping into destiny, leaving behind the fields that had never been worthy of his strength. Above, the stars began to reveal themselves as Tarentus fell away beneath him, infinite points of light in the darkness, each one a distant world holding its own trials and glories. Demetrian Titus, barely more than a boy, was already becoming something far greater. Chapter 2. The Scout Company Trials. The sterile white walls of the training vault seemed to press inward with the weight of centuries of expectation. Demetrian Titus stood among 37 other youths who had been selected from across 100 agri-worlds, mining colonies, and frontier settlements. All of them were exceptional by the standards of their homeworlds. None of them were exceptional enough, at least not yet. They understood this truth with the clarity that only fear and ambition combined could instill. Master of Initiates. Korak stood before them in his black fatigues, his massive frame casting shadows that seemed almost alive in the fluorescent lighting. His face was a landscape of scar tissue and focused intensity, each mark the result of centuries spent shaping raw potential into the finest warriors the Imperium could produce. When he surveyed the assembled youths, his eyes, one a piercing ice blue, the other milky white from an ancient wound, seemed to look through them rather than at them, reading something in their very essence that went beyond the merely physical. "The Scout Company does not want your strength," Corax announced, his voice carrying the resonance of absolute command. "Any animal possesses strength. What we seek is the capacity to endure when strength fails, to think clearly when panic would be justified, to maintain faith in the Emperor when reason offers only despair. You're here to become something more than human, and that transformation requires the death of everything you were before." His words hung in the sterile air like a pronouncement of doom. Around Titus, he could feel his fellow initiates responding, some with rigid fear, others with determined resignation. He recognized something in Corax's words that resonated with a deep part of himself, something that had always known this moment would come. "The trials will begin at dawn," Corax continued, his gaze settling briefly on each youth in turn. "You will sleep in the dormitories provided. Some of you will wake tomorrow, some of you will not wake at all. This is not cruelty, this is mercy. Better to discover your inadequacy now, quickly, rather than after you have been invested with the black carapace. The Emperor demands warriors, not failures." The dormitory where Titus was assigned was a long, narrow chamber lined with bunks arranged with military precision. There were no windows, no concessions to comfort. The walls were bare grey plasteel, unmarked by any decoration or personal effect. This was a space designed for rest and nothing more, and even that only to the extent that functionality demanded it. Titus lay on his assigned bunk, feeling the thin mattress beneath him, listening to the breathing of the other youths in the darkness. Some wept quietly, others lay in complete stillness, as though they had already begun the transformation from living beings to something harder, colder. Titus found his mind surprisingly clear, untouched by the panic that seemed to grip so many around him. If he did not survive the trials, it would mean only that he was not suited for this path. But something deep within him, something that had burned since childhood on Tarentus, whispered that survival was inevitable. The trials began with the dawn bells, a sound so discordant and jarring that it seemed designed specifically to shatter any remaining calm. The youths were herded into a gymnasium that stretched out like some vast cathedral to human achievement. Here, the real testing began. The first trial was the rope climb, much like the selection test, but longer, steeper, and with additional weight strapped to their bodies. Their instructors, all veteran scouts who bore the scars of their own trials, watched with clinical detachment as young men struggled upward against gravity and the limitations of their own bodies. When Titus ascended, rope held in hands that already carried calluses from farm labour, he moved with the smooth efficiency that had already become his trademark. But this time, he noticed something different. Other youths were climbing beside him, and some of them were nearly his equal. A youth named Kalen, dark-haired and lean with the coiled efficiency of a predator, climbed at nearly the same pace. For the first time, Titus felt competition not as an abstract concept, but as a tangible presence. He adjusted his pace, pushing harder, drawing on reserves he had not yet fully explored. When he reached the summit, Callan was perhaps 3 body lengths behind him, his face already showing the strain of maximum effort. As they descended, Callan caught Titus's eye and nodded, a gesture of respect between warriors that required no words. The trials consumed days that seemed to stretch into eternities. There were obstacle courses designed to test both speed and strategic thinking. Young men were required to navigate through corridors while instructors attempted to strike them down with practice weapons. Some broke bones, some lost consciousness. One youth, a quiet boy from a hive world, simply stopped moving and had to be carried away by the medical servitors. It was during the weapons training that Titus's true nature began to reveal itself. With a bolt pistol in one hand and a chainsword in the other, he discovered something that transcended mere physical prowess. There was a clarity to his thinking, a perfect integration of intention and action that made the weapons feel like extensions of his will. He moved through the practice drills with an economical grace, every motion exactly calculated to achieve its purpose with no wasted effort. His instructor, a grizzled scout called Sergeant Darius, watched with eyes that had evaluated hundreds of initiates over decades. "You have something," Darius told him after one particularly intensive drilling session. "Not everyone has it. Some gain it through effort, some never gain it at all. You possess it naturally." "What is it?" Titus asked, curious despite knowing that idle questions were discouraged during training. "The gift of the warrior," Darius replied. his scarred face creasing into something that might have been a smile. The ability to become one with violence, to treat killing not as a violation of natural order, but as a problem to be solved with precision and faith. That is what separates the merely strong from those who survive. The mental conditioning proved perhaps more demanding than the physical trials. In white-walled chambers designed to isolate sensory input, the initiates were subjected to indoctrination into the Ultramarines' philosophy. They learned the words of Robert Guilliman, the primarch of their chapter, until his teachings became as familiar as breathing. They were taught to meditate on the Emperor's divine nature, to understand that their own individuality was a limitation to be transcended, not a treasure to be protected. These sessions were painful in ways that physical exertion could never achieve. Titus found parts of his personality that had defined him on Tarentus, the yearning for individual greatness, the sense of being separate from his brothers, systematically deconstructed. In their place, something new was being constructed, a sense of purpose that transcended the self, a loyalty to the chapter, and the Emperor that ran deeper than blood. Callan, the dark-haired youth who had nearly matched him on the rope, became something like a friend, though friendship in this context was itself being systematically deconstructed. They sparred together regularly, each pushing the other to greater heights. Over weeks of brutal competition, Titus came to understand that Callan's style was more artistic, more adaptive, relying on reading opponents and responding with precisely calibrated movements. Where Titus was a hammer, Callan was a blade. "You're going to make it," Callan told him one evening, both of them bloodied and exhausted after a particularly intense sparring session, "all the way to the Black Carapace, maybe beyond." "So are you," Titus replied, recognizing the truth in his own statement. Callan smiled, but there was something sad in that expression. "Perhaps, but I think my path leads elsewhere. The Emperor guides us all, but not always to the same destination." By the time the trials reached their culmination, the original group of 37 had been reduced to 17. Some of the others had been transferred to other roles within the chapter: servitors, maintenance crews, other positions where their physical gifts could be channeled if their warrior spirit proved insufficient. 2 had simply died, their bodies unable to withstand the combined strain of physical ordeal and psychological reconstruction. The final trial was something that had not been explained, described, or hinted at. The initiates were brought to a circular chamber deep beneath the fortress of Hera, where nothing existed but empty space, and the expectation of pain. Here finally they would face their chosen weapons one last time, and here the Emperor would judge whether they were worthy. The fight was not against instructors or other initiates, it was against servitors, not the half-human remnants usually assigned to mundane tasks, but specialized combat units created specifically for this purpose. Each served as a final examination of everything that had been taught over the previous months. Titus found himself facing a servitor that had been enhanced with serrated blade limbs and reinforced skeletal plating. Its movements were jerky and inhuman, but no less dangerous for that. He fell into the meditative state that Sergeant Darius had taught him, becoming pure instrument of will and skill. The servitor moved toward him with mechanical precision, and Titus responded with organic grace. When it was over, the servitor lay deactivated on the sterile floor, its artificial body damaged beyond functional repair. Titus stood over it, breathing heavily, surprised to find that he felt no exultation, only a clear sense of purpose achieved. In the observation gallery above, Master of Initiates Corax watched the final trial conclude with one eye ice blue and satisfied, the other milky white and ancient with memory. When Demetrian Titus descended from that chamber, he was no longer entirely human. He was initiate now, closer to the metamorphosis that awaited him, but still bound by the limitations of his original biology. "You have proven yourself," Corax pronounced, his voice resounding through the chamber where all 17 survivors had been assembled. "Your transformation will begin. You will journey now to the Apothecarion, where the Black Carapace will be implanted. Some of you will not survive this process. Those who do will emerge as true sons of the Ultramarines, warriors of the Emperor himself. May your faith sustain you through what lies ahead." As Titus walked the corridors toward the Apothecarion, flanked by other survivors and the instructors who had pushed them to the edge of oblivion, he thought briefly of Tarentus and the red sun hanging over endless fields of grain. That life seemed impossibly distant now, as though it had belonged to someone else entirely. The boy from the Agri-world had died in these trials. What emerged would be something far greater, or nothing at all. There was no middle ground. There could be no retreat, only forward into the mysteries of what the Emperor's servants were becoming. Callan walked beside him, and their shoulders brushed briefly in the narrow corridor. Neither spoke. Words were no longer necessary. Everything that needed to be said had been written in blood and sacrifice, and the terrible beauty of transformation. The doors to the Apothecarian loomed before them, vast and heavy, marked with the Imperial Aquila and the sacred geometries of the Adeptus Astartes. Beyond those doors lay the final death, the one that would allow a true birth into greatness. Demetrian Titus stepped forward without hesitation, ready for whatever trials awaited. Chapter 3. The Rubicon Ascendant. The Apothecarian smelled of preservatives and sacrifice. Demetrian Titus lay upon the surgical platform, his entire body restrained by soft restraints that seemed almost comforting compared to what he knew was coming. Around him, the sterile white walls reflected the cold light of 1,000 instruments, each one designed with surgical precision for a singular, terrible purpose: the transformation of a human body into something that transcended human limitation. Master Apothecary Solus approached with movements that hinted at his ordered mind. His weathered face bore the marks of a century spent overseeing this ritual, each line a testament to the souls who had passed through this chamber before Titus. When he met Titus's eyes, there was no cruelty in that gaze, only a profound understanding of what suffering was about to begin, and a complete conviction that it was both necessary and just. "The black carapace is not a piece of armour," Solus said, his voice carrying the weight of words repeated countless times, yet never rendered ordinary by repetition. "It is the final integration of biology and technology. When we implant it directly into your nervous system, you will feel as though your body is being unmade cell by cell. This is not a malfunction. This is the price of becoming something greater than human." Titus wanted to speak, to acknowledge the weight of what was about to occur, but the sedatives already flowing through his veins had begun their work. His thoughts felt somehow distant, as though his consciousness was viewing itself from some great height. The orderlies moved around him with practiced efficiency, preparing his body, shaving the skin that would soon host machinery, mapping the neural pathways that would soon carry alien impulses. Solus began the incisions with a monomolecular blade that cut without tearing, creating precise pathways along Titus's spine and chest. The pain did not come immediately. First, there was only the strange sensation of being opened, of his body becoming something other than closed and whole. Then gradually, as the nerves recognized the violation, consciousness began to register what was happening. The first section of the black carapace was a length of hardened synth muscle, no thicker than a human finger, yet dense with circuitry and purpose. As it was threaded along his spinal cord, Titus's back arched involuntarily. Every nerve ending seemed to be screaming a warning that something fundamentally alien had entered the most protected chambers of his body. His vision exploded into colours that had no name, sensations that the human mind had no framework to comprehend. For a moment he existed in a state of absolute panic, his body convulsing against the restraints. Then, with the profound patience of one who had guided thousands through this metamorphosis, Solus administered another compound. Not a painkiller. There was no such thing during the Rubicon. Implantation. Rather, it was something that helped the consciousness accept the unacceptable, to find calm within the storm of transformation. "Breathe," Solus instructed. Though how Titus was supposed to manage such a simple action when every system of his body was in revolt he could not fathom. Yet he tried, he breathed, and with each breath the panic receded slightly, replaced by a sense of vast and terrible expansion. The surgery continued for hours that might have been days. Time became meaningless. The black carapace threads extended through his body like the roots of some mechanical tree, each one finding its neural home, each connection sending cascades of sensation through his consciousness. Portions of his brain that had never been used before suddenly blazed to life, flooded with information his original neurology had never been designed to process. He began to perceive things differently. The temperature variations in the room became visible to him like a heat map in his mind's eye. The slight vibrations of the machinery operating around him registered not as sound but as a kind of spatial awareness. He could sense their location and movement as clearly as if they were speaking. His own heartbeat, which had always been merely the background rhythm of existence, became something he could monitor with clinical precision, noting each fluctuation in pressure and oxygenation. At one point, or perhaps many points, as time remained impossible to measure, Solus leaned close and looked directly into Titus's eyes. "What do you feel?" the Master Apothecary asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity alongside the clinical assessment. Titus tried to answer, but his vocal cords seemed to have become something strange, something that required new programming to operate. What emerged was more gasp than speech. "I am scattered," he managed finally, "like I have been broken into pieces that do not quite remember how to fit together." Solus nodded, as though this was the response he had expected. "The neural mapping will stabilize within the next few hours. Your consciousness is learning how to integrate data from systems that your unaugmented brain simply could not process. You are not broken. You are being made whole in a way your original body could never achieve." The Master Apothecary continued working, connecting, adjusting, calibrating. The final section of the black carapace was the most delicate, a network of filaments that would integrate directly with Titus's frontal lobe, the portion of his brain responsible for rational thought and decision-making. As these connections were established, something profound shifted within him. The scattered sensation began to coalesce. The pieces of himself that had felt so violently separated began to recognize each other, to understand their new configuration. Information that had been flooding his consciousness in an incomprehensible torrent suddenly became organized, coherent. He could see how his heart beat in relation to his blood pressure. He could feel the slight variations in the room's temperature, could sense the movement of the orderlies around him through their subtle displacement of air. Most remarkably, he could perceive the electromagnetic emissions of the machinery that surrounded him, could map them with the same clarity that a normal human might perceive the room's layout through their eyes. "The integration is proceeding smoothly," Solus announced, reviewing data on a nearby cogitator screen. "Better than average, in fact. Your neural pathways seem particularly well suited for integration with advanced technology. Whether this is natural gifting or the result of your unusual constitution..." Solus trailed off, but Titus sensed there was more to that thought, something the Master Apothecary was choosing not to speak aloud. Hours later, how many hours Titus still could not say with certainty, Solus began the final stages of the procedure. The incisions were sealed with a biological adhesive that would harden into scar tissue, marking forever the places where human and machine had been fused. Titus was moved from the surgical platform to a recovery chamber, a bed that seemed somehow smaller than the surgical platform, though he realized this was only because he himself had been fundamentally altered. "Rest," Solus instructed. "The final integration will take approximately 72 hours. During this time, your consciousness may experience episodes of what we call phantom feedback, sensations and perceptions that are being generated by your new neural architecture but have no corresponding sensory input. This is normal. Do not resist them. Allow them to flow through you, and your mind will eventually categorize and integrate them properly." Titus tried to sleep, but sleep in the traditional sense seemed to be something that belonged to his previous existence. Instead, he found himself drifting through states of consciousness that were neither fully waking nor fully sleeping. His new neural augmentations seemed to require different forms of rest, moments where they powered down to minimal function, allowing the biological portions of his brain to engage in their necessary maintenance cycles. During these strange states, Titus found his mind wandering through memories with unprecedented clarity. He recalled the red sun of Tarentus with a vividness that seemed almost painful. He relived his ascent of the rope during the trials, remembering not just the sensation of climbing, but the precise mechanics of muscle deployment, the angle of his grip, the subtle shifts in weight distribution. It was as though his new augmentations were allowing him to analyze and understand experiences that his original body had simply lived through. On what he eventually recognized as the second day of his recovery, Solus came to him with several pieces of technology, a portion of the black carapace from a failed integration, he explained. "Touch it," the Master Apothecary instructed. "Feel how it responds to your presence." Titus reached out and made contact with the metal and wire construct. and he felt something extraordinary, a kind of electromagnetic resonance, a subtle dialogue occurring between the dormant technology and his own augmented nervous system. It was like touching an instrument that his hands had never learned to play, yet somehow his new augmentations immediately grasped its function and potential. "Exceptional," Solus murmured, noting the data with deep satisfaction. "You have an instinctive grasp of neural technical integration. This will serve you well when you receive your armor." On what Titus eventually recognized as the third day of recovery, the phantom feedback began to subside. His consciousness achieved a new equilibrium, still vastly larger than it had been, still capable of perceiving and processing data that would have driven his original mind to madness, yet organized now, manageable, his own. Solus conducted a final examination, running diagnostics through interfaces connected directly to the black carapace. His ancient eyes studied the data with an expression that suggested he was reading something written in a language known only to him, and those who shared his centuries of experience. "You may rise," Solus finally pronounced. "Move slowly. Your body will need to relearn basic functions with the weight and sensation of the augmentations integrated into your frame." Titus sat up carefully. The restraints had been removed at some point during his recovery, though he had no clear memory of when. His body felt simultaneously lighter and heavier than before. Lighter because the black carapace distributed his muscle weight more efficiently. Heavier because every nerve ending registered the presence of alien technology now woven through his biological substrate. He stood, and the world tilted in a way that had nothing to do with gravity. His new augmentations were processing information from dozens of new sensors, mapping the subtle shifts in his center of gravity, the minute adjustments his muscles were making to compensate. After a moment, his mind adjusted, and standing became simple again. In a nearby mirror, he saw himself for the first time since entering the Apothecarian. His face was still recognizably Demetrian Titus, the same basic structure, the same features. But something had changed in the eyes. They seemed to contain depths that hadn't existed before, as if he could see through to the machinery now installed behind them. "The black carapace is not something you wear," Solus said, appearing beside him as if he'd been waiting for precisely this moment of revelation. "It is something you become. Everything about your consciousness has been irrevocably altered. You will never again be entirely human. Neither will you be entirely machine. You're now something that exists in the space between a fusion of human will and technological precision that is stronger than either alone." Titus raised his hand, watching the way his new augmentations modulated the signals travelling through his arm. "What am I now?" he asked. "Space Marine," Solus replied simply. "One of the Emperor's finest, and if my reading of your neural patterns is correct, perhaps something rarer still. But that is for others to determine. Come, there are others like you now, others who have completed the Rubicon Ascendant. You must meet your brothers." As Titus followed Solus toward the chamber where the other augmented youths awaited, he thought briefly of the farm boy who had once worked beneath the red sun of Tarentus. That creature seemed impossibly distant now, separated from this new existence by more than time or space. He had crossed a threshold that could never be uncrossed, had accepted a burden that would carry him through centuries to come. The Rubicon had been crossed. There was no going back, only forward into whatever destiny the Emperor had written for augmented warriors such as himself. Behind him, the Apothecarian doors sealed with a soft hiss, a boundary between what he had been and what he had become. Chapter 4. Rise Through the Ranks. The meditation chamber of the Fortress of Hera existed in deliberate silence, a space where the ambient hum of machinery was filtered through acoustic systems designed to create perfect acoustic void. Here, in the months following his ascension to full Space Marine status, Demetrian Titus had learned to hear the Emperor's will, or so the chapter's priest taught. What he actually heard, he suspected, was the amplified whispering of his own black carapace as it processed the ambient electromagnetic landscape of the fortress, translating it into something approaching divinity. Veteran Sergeant Sidonus found him there, as he always did, exactly when Titus's meditation had reached its deepest point. The old warrior's footsteps, one slightly favouring the left leg, the result of an ancient wound that even Space Marine physiology could only partially compensate for. echoed in the chamber with measured precision. 5 decades, Titus, Sidonus said without preamble, his scarred face creasing into lines that suggested both approval and curiosity. 5 decades you have served in the 2nd Battle Company. Time enough for most warriors to face 10,000 enemies and die satisfied. Yet I sense something in you that hunger has not yet sated. Titus rose from his meditative posture with the fluid grace that his augmentations granted. Even after decades of integration, he was still discovering new capabilities encoded within the black carapace, new ways his body could move that seemed to violate the natural laws governing baseline humanity. The blessing of the Emperor made many things possible that would otherwise be impossible. The chapter's enemies grow more numerous, Titus replied, his voice carrying the measured tones of one still learning the protocols of proper address. Each victory over the Orcs, the Tyranids, the Heretics, each triumph only reveals greater threats beyond. I do not believe we will ever face 10,000 enemies and find an end, Sergeant. I believe we will face 10,000 enemies per campaign, eternally, until the Emperor calls us to final glory. Sidonus studied him with eyes that had witnessed centuries of combat. The sergeant was ancient by the standards of those who had not undergone the Black Carapace procedure at precisely the right age, his face a topography of scars that represented every major conflict the Second Company had endured over the past 3 centuries. When he smiled, which he did now, it was an expression that suggested recognition of something profound. "Then you understand," Sidonus said simply. "Come, the chapter master has requested your presence. A new command structure is being formed, and your name has been raised." The briefing chamber where Captain Torius Telion held court was a space designed to inspire both respect and clarity. Hololithic displays showed battlefields across the Ultramarines' territory of responsibility, each one marked with symbols indicating threat level, engagement status, and probability of favourable outcome. When Titus entered, accompanied by Sidonus, the captain looked up from a tactical overview of a Tyranid splinter fleet, encroaching on the forge world of Graia. Captain Telion's face bore the marks of his decades in command, not merely the physical scars, but something more fundamental. His eyes carried the weight of every decision that had resulted in casualties, every strategic miscalculation that had cost lives, and yet there was no regret in that gaze, only the crystalline clarity of one who had learned that perfection was impossible, and that the pursuit of it was the highest virtue available to mortal beings. "Titus," Telion acknowledged, his voice carrying the precise enunciation of someone for whom speech was an instrument to be wielded with surgical precision. "Sidonus speaks highly of you, claims you possess a quality he has not witnessed in any other warrior of our chapter for at least a century." That is a significant assertion. Titus stood at attention, his posture reflecting military discipline so complete it transcended the merely physical. Every muscle was positioned exactly as chapter doctrine demanded, yet somehow his body suggested more than mere obedience. It suggested purposeful readiness. "I aspire only to serve the Emperor and the chapter, Captain," Titus replied formally. "A answer that is simultaneously true and evasive," Telion observed, his expression shifting into something that might have been amusement. "The Tactical Assessment Division believes you should be elevated to Squad Sergeant. Such elevation, at your stage of service, is unusual. Typically, a warrior would require at least twice your tenure before such responsibility was granted. Sidonus believes you are ready. I intend to trust his judgment, though I will warn you, Squad Sergeants bear the weight of their warriors' lives. Every decision you make, every tactical choice, every moment where you hesitate or act decisively, results in consequences measured in blood and sacrifice." "I understand, Captain," Titus said, and something in the way he spoke those words, not with confidence, but with absolute certainty, caused Telion to nod slowly. "Then the responsibility is yours. You will take command of Squad Cleandus, whose previous sergeant fell in honourable combat on the frozen wastes of Tarax. They are experienced warriors, all of them, and some may resent being commanded by one younger than they, regardless of the chapter's judgment in your favour. That resentment must be overcome through competence and the demonstrated willingness to stand with them in the face of whatever horrors the galaxy presents." The transition to command came rapidly. Titus's first act was to request a private meeting with each member of Squad Cleandus individually. Such meetings took time. The squad consisted of 9 brothers, each with decades of experience, but Titus understood that leadership was built not through proclamation, but through understanding. He needed to know not merely the capabilities and histories of these warriors, but something more fundamental, the character of their hearts, the specific nature of their fears and strengths. Brother Corax was the oldest, a warrior who had fought in campaigns against the Orcs of Gazdrak 200 years prior. His right eye was augmented, the biological original having been destroyed in combat, and he carried himself with the weariness of one who had simply endured too much violence for any single lifetime to bear. When Titus asked him why he continued to serve, Corax had smiled sadly. "What else is there?" the ancient warrior had replied. "To leave the chapter is to deny the Emperor's purpose. To remain is to hope that eventually my sacrifice might contribute to some greater victory that my limited mind cannot yet perceive. I serve because the Emperor wills it. When I am deemed no longer capable, the chapter will assign me to other duties. Until then, I follow whoever commands me with competence." Brother Kai was younger, only 60 years in service, yet he carried within him a hunger that seemed to contradict the meditative calm that most Space Marines cultivated. When Titus asked him about his goals, Kai had been remarkably straightforward. "I wish to achieve what few warriors ever achieve," Kai had said, his voice carrying an intensity that verged on dangerous. "I wish to become legendary, not merely competent, not merely effective, but remembered. When other warriors speak of the deeds of Squad Cleandus, I wish them to speak with awe. Is that pride? Perhaps, but the Emperor created us to be his finest instruments, and I believe it is an insult to our creation to be merely adequate." Their first engagement as a unified squad came against a Tyranid splinter fleet that had breached the orbital defences of the Forge World Vanille. The engagement was catastrophic. The Tyranids, though fewer in number than expected, possessed a collective intelligence that anticipated human tactics with devastating accuracy. 3 squads were deployed to defend the primary power generation facility. Titus found himself commanding from a position where he could observe the entire engagement, seeing patterns in the Xenos' movements that spoke of something rare among Tyranids: genuine strategic thinking, not merely instinctive hunger. "The Hive cluster is using the secondary entrance to flank our position," Titus reported to Captain Telion via Vox. "They are sacrificing the main assault force to draw our fire, while the flanking elements move to cut off retreat routes. The tactical doctrine is unsound for Tyranids. They typically do not embrace resource waste in this manner." "What do you propose?" Telion's calm voice replied, seemingly untroubled by the massive pressure of combat. "Permit the flanking maneuver to advance further," Titus said, already calculating firing, trajectories and movement vectors. "When they commit fully to the flanking assault, we will rotate Squad Ferox to intercept. The Xenos will be caught between established positions and fresh warriors, with diminished numerical advantage." The tactic worked. More than that, it worked with such precision that the Forge World's defenders were able to consolidate their position and eventually force the Tyranid splinter fleet to withdraw. In the aftermath, when the final casualty count was tallied, Squad Cleandus had sustained no fatalities, and only minor casualties among the other squads involved in the engagement. The incident was noted by higher command. Brother Kai approached Titus afterward, his scarred face reflecting what appeared to be genuine respect. "You saw something in their movements that the rest of us missed," Kai had said quietly. "That is the quality that separates the legendary from the merely capable. That is the difference between warriors who die and warriors who are remembered." Over the next 5 decades of service, Titus climbed steadily through the ranks of the 2nd Battle Company. Promotions came, each one bringing greater responsibility and access to more advanced weaponry and armor modifications. He served alongside Captain Telion through 4 major campaigns, distinguishing himself repeatedly through tactical brilliance that seemed to border on the prescient. Where other commanders relied upon doctrine and experience, Titus possessed an almost supernatural ability to perceive the intention behind enemy movements before those movements were fully realized. His reputation grew. Other squads began to request assignment to his command structure. Young warriors seeking to become legendary sought placement under a commander whose tactical vision seemed to offer the possibility of surviving long enough to achieve greatness. Yet despite the accolades, despite the steady accumulation of honours and decorations, Titus maintained a contemplative distance from his own legend. He understood something that not all warriors did. That legend was often a burden more than an achievement. Other warriors began to rely upon his decisions with a faith that bordered on religious, and that faith was sometimes misplaced. There were engagements where his tactical vision failed, where Xenos or heretics did something unexpected that disrupted his careful calculations. On one particular campaign, against Orc warboss Scartooth on the toxic world of Vendris Prime, Titus had miscalculated the warboss's likely tactical response. The error had cost the lives of 17 warriors from allied squads. He'd stood over their bodies afterward and felt something that might have been grief, though the chapter's psychological conditioning was designed to elevate such emotions into something more abstract. Regret became recognition of lessons learned. Loss became motivation for future victories. Sidonus had found him there, staring at the 17, corpses arranged in perfect military formation, awaiting the chapter's final rites. "You blame yourself," the old sergeant had observed. It was not a question. "I made an error," Titus replied simply. "That error resulted in deaths. The logic is straightforward." "The logic is also incomplete," Sidonus countered. "You also made dozens of correct calculations. You also prevented the destruction of a greater force. You also ensured that Scartooth was brought to sufficient vulnerability that the final assault could succeed. 17 deaths in a campaign where thousands might have died, and would have, had your calculations been consistently incorrect. That is not failure, Titus. That is the price of attempting greatness." Yet the incident had changed something in Titus. His calculations became even more conservative. Where previously he had been willing to take calculated risks for tactical advantage, he now became focused on minimizing casualty rates even at the cost of sometimes suboptimal strategic outcomes. Other warriors began to notice this shift, some interpreting it as weakness, others recognizing it as the mark of a commander who had learned the true weight of command. Captain Telian noticed as well. Upon Titus's 80th year of service in the Second Company, Telian had called him to private audience. "You have become something rare," the captain had said, studying Titus with the intensity of one seeing a complex problem from a new angle. "You possess tactical brilliance, yet you temper that brilliance with compassion for those warriors under your command. Most commanders achieve one or the other, rarely both. This is a quality that will either make you legendary or will eventually destroy you, depending on circumstances beyond our control." "I do not seek legend," Titus had replied. "I seek only to fulfill my purpose, and to ensure that my warriors survive long enough to fulfill their own." Telian had nodded slowly, as though this answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "That response alone confirms that you will indeed become legendary. Come, there is something the chapter master wishes to discuss with you regarding your future assignments." That conversation had led to Titus's reassignment to command of the entire 2nd Battle Company, a promotion that elevated him to captain rank and brought with it the full weight of hundreds of warriors' lives. And with that promotion had come a reputation that preceded him, a warrior captain who was simultaneously brilliant and merciful, decisive yet thoughtful, capable of commanding respect through demonstrated excellence rather than through mere rank and authority. It was a reputation that would eventually carry him into dangers that no mere tactical brilliance could overcome, but that lay in the future, still decades ahead. For now, in the quiet moment before the storm, Demetrian Titus stood at the height of his power, a legend among the Ultramarines, a commander whose name was whispered with respect by warriors and officers alike throughout the chapter. He did not know it yet, but he had already begun to walk the path that would lead to his greatest triumphs and his darkest trials. The Emperor's plan, like all such plans, operated on a scale that even the most brilliant minds could only partially perceive. The red sun of Tarentus seemed impossibly distant now, separated from this moment by more than mere time or space. That Agri-World child, who had once yearned for something greater than soil and harvest, had found what he sought. Whether he would survive the consequences of that discovery remained to be written by the Emperor's own mysterious will. Chapter 5. The Graia. Invasion begins. The descent through Graia's atmosphere felt like falling through layers of ascending darkness. Captain Titus felt the characteristic shudder of the dropship as it fought against the planet's turbulent upper winds, each tremor transmitting through the armoured hull with the rhythm of a massive heartbeat. Around him, the 2nd Battle Company sat in rigid silence, 200 warriors of the Ultramarines arrayed in perfect military formation, their armour bearing the scars of 100 campaigns, their augmented minds processing tactical data through the constant whisper of their black carapaces. Beside Titus sat Veteran Sergeant Sidonus, his ancient frame somehow more imposing in the confines of the dropship than it had ever been in the fortress of Hera. The old warrior's hands rested lightly on his bolter, movements hinting at the eternal readiness that defined the greatest veterans of the chapter. When he glanced at Titus, there was something in that ancient gaze, approval mixed with the weight of knowing what horrors awaited them below. The Vox crackled to life, carrying the strained voice of the pilot through waves of static. "Captain Titus, we're encountering heavy resistance. Imperial Guard outposts are under severe pressure. Orc landing craft are touching down at a rate of approximately 1 per minute. Estimating enemy ground strength at, well, sir, honestly, we don't have enough cogitator capacity to properly quantify the numbers. There are a lot of them." Titus's jaw tightened slightly, the only visible manifestation of the rapid calculations occurring within his augmented mind. He activated the tactical display mounted on the dropship's interior wall, and immediately a chaotic mass of red symbols bloomed across the map of Graia. Orc positions, hundreds of them. Thousands, perhaps, if the density estimates were accurate. "How long until we reach the primary landing zone?" Titus asked, his calm voice filling the transport with the weight of absolute authority. "Approximately 4 minutes, Captain," the pilot replied, his voice carrying the barely controlled tension of one who had learned to trust Space Marines with his life. "We'll be putting down near the Manufactura Majerkis. That's where the Guard is making their last stand against the Xenos advance." Titus nodded, already beginning to reorganize his company's deployment pattern based on this new information. What had been a planned defensive operation was rapidly evolving into something far more urgent, a crisis containment scenario. The Orcs were advancing faster than Imperial intelligence had predicted, which meant either the Xenos possessed greater tactical coordination than usual, or something else was driving their assault with unusual velocity and purpose. He turned to address his company, his voice carrying through the Vox network to reach every warrior. "The situation has evolved. Guard forces are being overwhelmed at Manufactorum. Majerkis. We will establish a defensive perimeter and consolidate Guard strength. First squad with me, 2nd through 5th squads will anchor the southern approach. 6th and 7th hold the eastern flank. All squads maintain communication discipline. When we land, this dropship becomes a firebase. Use it for fire support until the Orcs breach effective range, then reposition to fallback positions marked on your tactical displays." The company acknowledged with the precision born of centuries of coordinated warfare. Around him, warriors checked weapons with methodical certainty, each motion executed with the mechanical perfection that the black carapace enabled. This was what they had been designed for, the moment where all their training, all their enhancements, all their faith in the Emperor and the chapter crystallized into a singular purpose: to hold the line against impossible odds. The dropship's landing struts struck the cracked, contaminated soil of Graia with a bone-rattling impact. The ramp descended, and for a moment the sounds of the planet itself rushed inward. The constant grinding of heavy machinery still functioning despite the chaos, the distant roar of Orc engines, and beneath it all, the irregular percussion of Imperial-less fire and bolter rounds. Graia had once been a jewel of Imperial industry, a forge world where the servants of the Adeptus Mechanicus had maintained and produced the machinery of war. Now it was a nightmare landscape of twisted metal and dying machines. Massive industrial structures that had stood for 10,000 years were collapsing under the assault of green-skinned Xenos who understood only the language of destruction. Orc landing craft, ramshackle structures that seemed to violate every principle of aeronautical engineering, sat burning in impact craters across the landscape, yet more continued to descend from the yellow-grey sky with relentless regularity. As Titus descended the ramp, his boots striking the contaminated earth with solid impacts, he immediately began categorizing what he perceived. The Orcs had achieved local superiority in numbers, yes, but their organization was degrading rapidly. The initial assault force was losing cohesion, becoming fragmented into smaller warbands competing for kills rather than working in coordinated fashion. This was typical for Orc forces, but the sheer numbers suggested they were being driven by something beyond mere instinctive hunger for battle. "Commander Thorn, do you read me?" Titus transmitted on the Guard frequencies, already noting the designation of the Imperial commander from his rapid scan of available communications. "Space Marine, thank the Emperor," came the reply, a woman's voice sharp with controlled panic. "I'm at the Manufactorum Central Tower. We're being overrun. I don't know how much longer we can hold. If you have reinforcements, deploy them now." "I do," Titus replied, gesturing to his first squad to advance toward the tower's position. As he moved forward, his augmented senses were painting an increasingly complex picture of the tactical situation. The Orcs weren't simply attacking randomly. They were focusing their assault on specific points, which meant leadership. Somewhere among the Green Horde, a warboss or nob of significant capability was directing the invasion with more sophistication than typical for Xenos of this variety. The square before the Manufactorum had become a killing ground. Imperial Guard soldiers, brave and disciplined though they were, could not match the physical prowess of Astartes warriors. Where a Space Marine could punch through a 3-meter thick armor plate, a Guard soldier with standard equipment could barely dent reinforced ceramite. Yet they held the line regardless, knowing that their survival depended on the arrival of the Emperor's finest warriors. Miranda Nero stood atop a barricade of overturned trucks, her laser rifle still crackling with residual charge from recent discharge. She was young by Guard standards, her face bearing the distinctive tattoos of the Graia Defense Corps, and her eyes carried the terrible clarity of someone who had watched too many of her comrades die. When she saw Titus and his Space Marines advancing through the Orc lines, her expression shifted into something between relief and resignation. The relief that reinforcements had arrived, the resignation that those reinforcements meant the situation was desperate enough to require the Emperor's finest. "Captain," she called, her voice cutting through the constant sounds of violence. "The warboss, they're calling him Grimskull. He's coordinating from a position roughly 3 kilometers to the northeast. He's got a command structure dug in around the ruins of the old hive spire. Every time we try to advance, he commits reserves to push us back." Titus processed this information rapidly, cross-referencing it with the tactical data his augmented mind was continuously processing. 3 kilometers in an active combat zone was nothing. Perhaps 30 minutes of hard fighting under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances. The Orcs were maintaining pressure across the entire front, which meant pulling forces for an assault on the command structure would weaken the defensive lines. "We need to hold this position," Titus said to Sidonus, his ancient sergeant nodding slowly as he absorbed the tactical implications. "If we abandon the Manufactorum, we lose high ground and allow the Orcs to consolidate. Sidonus, maintain the perimeter. I'm taking first squad and advancing on the warboss position. If we can eliminate Grimskull, the coordination will collapse and the Orc assault will fragment." It was a calculated risk, leaving 2/3 of his company to defend while committing 1/3 to assault directly on a warboss in his entrenched position. But that was what command required, the ability to distribute forces in such a way that seemed illogical until the moment the calculations achieved their intended purpose. "What about the Guard?" Miranda asked, her eyes meeting Titus's with the clarity of a soldier who understood the brutal mathematics of warfare. "They hold this position," Titus replied. "They have the high ground, they have clear fields of fire, and they have Space Marines holding the critical points of the perimeter. As long as they hold discipline, they can maintain this line. Can your soldiers follow orders?" "They're Guard," Miranda said simply. "Following orders is the one thing we do better than anything else." Titus nodded, then activated the broader company Vox. "Sidonus takes command of the perimeter. All non-first squad elements respond to Sergeant Sidonus for positioning. First squad, with me. We're advancing on the warboss position. Stay sharp. This is going to be a fast strike directly into enemy territory. No delay, no hesitation. We move with purpose, and we end this." As he assembled first squad and began moving through the ruins toward the distant command structure, Titus found his mind dwelling briefly on something that had troubled him since the initial tactical briefing. The coordination of this Orc invasion was too sophisticated, the numerical commitment too precise. Warboss Grimskull, by all accounts, was a competent commander, but competence did not explain the mathematical elegance with which the assault was being prosecuted. Something else was driving this invasion, some force beyond the simple hunger and brutality that typically motivated Orcs. The realization settled in his consciousness with the weight of terrible premonition. But there was no time for such considerations now. The Orcs were everywhere. streaming across the ruins in waves of green flesh and crude weaponry, their roars shaking the very air with the primal force of their hunger. Titus's bolter spoke with practiced precision, each shot finding its mark, each kill clearing the path forward for his squad. First squad moved like a lethal prayer, their discipline and training creating a bubble of order within the chaos. They were not the most numerous force on this field, but they were by far the most dangerous. Every gesture was economical, every shot calculated, every step advancing toward the objective with inexorable determination. Behind them, the sounds of combat at the Manufactorum continued, and Titus found himself both trusting in Sidonus's capability and acutely aware that he had deployed his most experienced warrior in a defensive role, while reserving the fresher elements of the company for an assault directly into enemy territory. It was, by traditional military doctrine, completely backward. But then again, Demetrian Titus had learned long ago that traditional military doctrine existed for armies that fought other armies, not for warriors of the Emperor who faced Xenos, heretics, and the very spawn of chaos itself. Sometimes, the surest way to defend was to advance. Sometimes, the best defense was to eliminate the threat before it had time to consolidate. The war boss was waiting. Titus could feel it in the tactical patterns, in the way the Orc forces were gradually concentrating around the command position. Grimskull understood that the arrival of Space Marines had changed the strategic equation. The Xenos was probably already formulating retreat contingencies, calculating how to preserve his force when the inevitable moment came that human warriors encountered the deadly efficiency of Astartes warriors in close combat. But retreat was a mercy that this invasion would not receive. Graia would hold, the Forge world would endure, and Demetrian Titus, captain of the Ultramarines' 2nd Battle Company, would ensure it through the only language that Xenos truly understood, the absolute and irrevocable language of overwhelming force applied with surgical precision. The ruins rushed past him, and somewhere in the distance a massive orc roared in challenge, its voice carrying the weight of understanding that a true opponent had arrived on the field. The real battle was about to begin. Chapter 6. The Purging of Graia. 3 days of unrelenting warfare had transformed the ruins of Graia into something approaching a nightmare landscape rendered in stone and blood. The Manufactorum Ajacis remained an anchor point for human resistance, but barely. Its defences degrading by the hour as Orc assaults grew more desperate, more furious. Titus had maintained his position at the defensive perimeter with the stoic acceptance of one who understood that warfare was simply suffering prolonged across time until one side or the other broke beneath the weight of attrition. But the Orcs showed no signs of breaking. If anything, their assault had intensified, driven by something that transcended the usual hunger and brutality. Every attempt by Titus's scouts to penetrate deeper into Orc territory had met with organised resistance, suggesting a level of coordination that defied the Xenos' typical doctrinal patterns. Something was driving Warboss Grimskull with unusual purpose, something beyond the simple conquest that usually motivated Orc invasions. It was during the 3rd night of the campaign that the augury arrays detected it. "Captain," Sidonus reported, his ancient voice carrying the particular quality of controlled alarm, "long-range sensors are detecting massive energy signature approximately 15 kilometers southeast of our position. Pattern recognition suggests Emperor's Mercy. It's a Warlord-class Titan." Titus felt the weight of that statement settle upon him like a physical burden. A Warlord Titan was one of the most devastating weapons in the Imperium's arsenal, a walking cathedral of war, capable of levelling entire city blocks with a single volley from its primary weapons array. For the Orcs to have somehow captured or activated such a machine would represent a catastrophic shift in the tactical equation. "Confirm," Titus commanded, his mind already beginning to recalculate deployment patterns based on this new information. "Confirmed," came the reply from the augury team. "The Titan is moving. Its current trajectory will bring it to the Manufactorum position in approximately 40 minutes. Captain, that machine will breach our defences. There is no defence against a Warlord Titan." Titus stood in silence, processing this information with the cold clarity that his augmentations enabled. 40 minutes. In 40 minutes, the most powerful defensive positions ever constructed by baseline humanity would be reduced to slag by the weapons of a super-heavy war machine. The entire campaign would collapse. Graia would fall. Then he understood. This had been Grimskull's strategy from the beginning. The assault on the Manufactorum, the scattered Orc landings across the planet, all of it had been designed to distract from a singular objective, to activate the Titan. Somewhere in the depths of Graia, in a facility the Adeptus Mechanicus had apparently lost contact with centuries ago, one of humanity's ultimate weapons still rested, waiting only for the power requirements to be met and the security protocols to be overridden. The Orcs, possessing neither the knowledge nor the capability to accomplish such a feat themselves, must have had assistance. "All squads, this is Titus," he transmitted across the company vox. "Abandon the Manufactorum. I want a fighting withdrawal to the secondary positions. Sidonus, coordinate with Commander Nero. Guard forces are to regroup at the stronghold buildings on the western ridge. We are ceding ground to preserve the force." The withdrawal was executed with the precision born of 200 Space Marines, operating in perfect tactical harmony. What might have been a rout in any other military force became a controlled retrograde action, each squad covering the others, the fire lanes maintained with surgical precision. The Orcs attempted to pursue, but they found themselves quickly brought under murderous fire by warriors who understood that retreat was simply another form of warfare. But the real problem was not the Orcs themselves. The real problem was the Warlord Titan, now visible as a distant spire of metal and engine fire against the yellow-grey sky. The machine was vast beyond comprehension, a creature of the machine god rendered in ceramite and plasma, its body bristling with weapons that could destroy squadrons of spacecraft. As it advanced on the defensive positions, its footsteps registering on seismic sensors as micro-earthquakes, Titus realized that this moment represented the true crisis point of the campaign. If the Titan reached Graia's central defensive network, the planetary government would fall, the Forge world would become an Orc stronghold, and the resources committed to retaking it would dwarf anything the Ultramarines could commit. This was the moment where the battle would be lost or won. "Brother Kai," Titus transmitted on the private squad channel, "I need you to do something almost certainly suicidal. I need you to reach the Titan's primary reactor chamber and find the activation control nexus. In your expert opinion, do you believe an explosive charge properly placed could override the security protocols and shut the machine down?" There was a brief pause, perhaps 2 seconds, while the warrior processed the request. "Yes, Captain," Kai replied, his voice carrying the bright clarity of one about to attempt something glorious or fatal. "I believe I could accomplish that. With standard demolitions charges, I could sever the connections between the reactor core and the primary control matrix. The machine would be inert but recoverable. I won't lie, sir. The odds of me surviving are minimal." "Understood," Titus said. "Begin movement toward the Titan immediately. I will draw its fire and create the opening you need. When you're in position, you will have approximately 90 seconds to complete the detonation. Do not expect that to increase. We will hold the position here." Brother Kai, his legendary hunger for achievement burning bright, acknowledged the order without hesitation. What followed was perhaps the most audacious tactical maneuver of the entire campaign. Titus took a squad of only 8 warriors and began advancing directly toward the approaching Titan, firing sustained bolter volleys at the machine's lower armor plates. It was madness, 9 warriors against a construct that weighed as many tons as a small hive city. The Titan, noticing the attack on its lower extremities, began to respond. When the Warlord's primary plasma cannon fired, the beam of superheated energy was so intense that it turned sand into glass and stone into vapor. The landscape itself seemed to scream in protest. Titus's squad scattered, using every scrap of cover available, moving with the fluid grace that only Space Marines could achieve. But they were not trying to destroy the Titan. They were trying to keep its attention focused on them rather than on the direction from which Brother Kai was approaching. The Orc pilots, if pilots they were, if they possessed anything resembling strategic understanding, seemed to recognize the threat. The Titan began shifting its stance, attempting to track the mobile targets while maintaining awareness of the broader battlefield. Titus found himself engaging in a dance of terrible geometry, advancing and retreating in patterns designed to maximize the Titan's targeting confusion, while maintaining positions where his warriors could inflict maximum damage without being vaporized in the process. 47 seconds elapsed. Brother Kai reached the Titan's leg assembly and began climbing, using cracks in the armor plating as handholds. The machine was so vast that even at close range it barely seemed to notice the individual warrior attempting to scale its form. Titus continued his assault, pressing forward with renewed urgency, buying those precious seconds of attention that might mean the difference between success and failure. 63 seconds elapsed. Kai reached the primary reactor chamber aperture, his hands working with the rapid precision of one conducting explosives placement under maximum temporal pressure. The demolitions charges, carefully calibrated to disrupt the connection protocols rather than destroy the reactor itself, were positioned with mathematical exactness. 81 seconds elapsed. The charges detonated. There was no massive explosion, no pyrotechnic display. Instead, there was a subtle shift in the Warlord Titan's posture. The machine lurched, its movements becoming erratic and discoordinated. The weapon's fire ceased. The targeting system, suddenly unable to receive coherent commands from the control matrix, defaulted to neutral standing positions. The Titan became an inert monument to lost humanity, a prison of dormant machine spirits waiting for the day when the Adeptus Mechanicus might restore it to function. Brother Kai descended carefully, his augmented biology, able to survive impacts that would liquefy baseline humanity. He landed before Titus, his armor bearing scorch marks from the reactor chamber deactivation sequence, his face bearing the expression of one who has accomplished something extraordinary. "Objective complete, Captain," Kai reported, his voice steady despite the obvious strain of what he had just survived. But the campaign was far from over. With the Titan neutralized, the Orcs lost their primary advantage. Yet Grimskull himself remained unaccounted for, and Titus's tactical assessment suggested the warboss would not surrender, simply because his gambit had failed. Xenos rarely possessed such sophistication in military thinking. Grimskull would attempt to consolidate his remaining forces and mount a final desperate assault. This time, Titus was ready. The final confrontation came at the ruins of the old hive spire, where the Orc command structure had established its primary stronghold. Titus arrived with 2 full squads, understanding that Warboss Grimskull would likely commit his own elite warriors, the Knobs, the brutal hulking creatures who served as his most feared lieutenants. Warboss Grimskull himself was a mountain of green flesh and crude augmentation. His armour was fashioned from scrap metal and bone, pieced together through 100 brutal campaigns. His weapons, a massive chopper and something that might have charitably been called a pistol, were crude by Imperial standards, yet carried the weight of something that had crushed countless opponents across the years. "Space Marine," Grimskull growled, his voice like boulders grinding together. "You fight good. You get to die good." What followed was perhaps the most personal moment of the entire campaign. Titus and Grimskull faced each other across the broken courtyard, their respective warriors arrayed behind them in grim anticipation. In many ways, this was a contest that transcended the larger tactical picture. This was warrior meeting warrior, predator meeting predator, to determine which one's worldview would ultimately prevail. Titus did not speak. He simply advanced, his bolter tucked aside in favour of his combat blade, a weapon blessed by the Adeptus Mechanicus and tempered through 10,000 years of service in the Emperor's name. When Grimskull charged, Titus moved to meet him with the perfect economy of motion that decades of augmented existence had provided. The first blow came from Grimskull, his chopper descending in an arc that would have severed a basilisk's spine. Titus sidestepped with the precision of an augmented consciousness, processing dozens of variables simultaneously. The angle of approach, the mass of the weapon, the momentum available to Grimskull, the position of his own feet. The duel became a blur of motion, each combatant matching the other blow for blow, stroke for stroke. But Grimskull was old, and old warriors lose to younger warriors who possess equal skill and unlimited time. Titus was patient. He allowed the warboss to tire, to make small errors, to commit weight in slightly suboptimal patterns. And when the moment finally came, after what might have been minutes or hours, Titus could not precisely say, he struck. His blade found the gap in Grimskull's armour, the place where crude craftsmanship met the limits of improvised protection. The warboss fell, his final roar echoing across the ruins of Graia, as he understood that he had finally met a warrior whose will was equal to his own. The Orcs, seeing their leader fall, seemed to lose the thread of coordinated resistance. Without Grimskull's brutal leadership and the promise of victory that his presence embodied, The greenskins began to fragment into smaller raiding parties, attempting to escape the trap that Graia had become. The campaign was effectively over. Graia would be secured. The Forge world would remain in the hands of the Imperium. But as Titus stood over the fallen warboss, his blade still dripping with orc blood, something troubled him. The level of coordination, the activation of the Titan, the precise timing of the assault, all of it suggested something beyond the capabilities of even a legendary warboss. Someone had planned this invasion with Imperial tactical sophistication. Someone with knowledge of Graia's defences and capabilities. As he would later discover, that someone was far more dangerous than any orc could ever be. For now, though, Graia was secure, and Demetrian Titus had added another victory to his growing legend. The name of the captain who had held the Forge world against impossible odds would soon be whispered with respect throughout the Ultramarines chapter, spoken of as one of the greatest commanders of the age. Neither Titus nor any of those who fought beside him understood that this victory had been orchestrated by forces that watched from deeper shadows, that his triumph was already being woven into something darker and more terrible than any of them could yet perceive. The greatest trials of his life were only just beginning. Chapter 7. The Chaos Revelation. The victory celebration lasted precisely 4 hours before the first auguries began to fail. Titus noticed it first, a subtle corruption in the electromagnetic data his black carapace was processing, as if something was introducing noise into systems that should have been crystalline in their clarity. He dismissed it initially as residual interference from the Warlord Titan's deactivation sequence, but when he checked the broader company-wide sensor networks, the pattern repeated. Something was wrong with the fundamental reality of Graia itself. "Captain," Sidonus's gravelly voice crackled across the secure channel. "I'm detecting energy signatures that match nothing in the Imperial database. They're faint, but they're moving through the ruins toward our position. My augmentations are having difficulty maintaining accurate tracking. It's like something is distorting the space around them." Titus immediately activated full tactical alert across the second company. Whatever was approaching, it was using methodologies that transcended standard orc technology. The Xenos warriors who had fought at Graia had been brutal and effective, but they operated within understandable parameters. This was something else entirely, something that seemed to operate according to rules that Titus's centuries of combat experience had no framework to comprehend. The first casualties came without warning. A squad of 10 warriors under the command of Brother Leandros was conducting a perimeter sweep when they encountered the phenomenon. The squad's vox ceased mid-transmission, not going to static but simply stopping, as if the warriors had forgotten mid-sentence that they were supposed to be communicating. When Titus's scouts reached their last known position, they found the warriors still breathing, their armour still intact, yet the men inside those suits had become something other than themselves. Their eyes, usually clear and focused with the clarity of augmented consciousness, now held depths that suggested something alien had taken residence behind them. Brother Leandros himself stood at the centre of the corrupted squad, and when he turned to face the approaching Space Marines, his movement seemed somehow wrong, disjointed, as though the consciousness piloting his massive augmented body was not entirely familiar with its mechanisms. "What happened?" Titus demanded, his bolt pistol already drawn, though something in his tactical assessment suggested conventional weapons might be irrelevant against whatever had infected his warriors. "Brother Captain," Leandros replied, and his voice was his own, but layered beneath it was something else, an additional voice that seemed to come from somewhere other than his physical location. "We encountered contact with forces of the enemy. They were not physically present at first. They were woven into the very fabric of this place. The orcs were merely a distraction. Tool, the true assault comes from the warp itself." Horror crystallized in Titus's consciousness with the cold clarity of one who understands that the tactical situation has evolved beyond anything military doctrine could address. Chaos. The orcs had been herded here by forces of the ruinous powers, used to soften Imperial defences and open gateways for something far more terrible. The black carapace began to scream warnings into his consciousness, psychic disturbances, reality distortions, the fundamental laws of physics bending in ways that should have been impossible. Graia was becoming corrupted, drawn into the warp itself by forces that viewed the material universe as little more than a canvas for their malign intentions. "All squads consolidate at the primary stronghold," Titus transmitted. his voice carrying the absolute authority of command despite the rising tide of uncertainty in his augmented mind. Establish a ritual perimeter. Activate all available psychic shielding. This is now a containment operation. We are to prevent the corruption from spreading beyond Graia's orbital parameters. Brother Kai approached, his legendary reputation for tactical brilliance now layered with the burden of understanding that they were facing an enemy that could not be killed by bolter fire or elite warrior skill. Captain, I'm detecting what appears to be a Chaos Sorcerer at the epicenter of the disturbance, approximately located at the ruins of the old Temple District, roughly 8 kilometers from our current position. If we can eliminate the Sorcerer, the rituals binding the warp breach might collapse. It was a gamble, a desperate hope founded more on faith than on tactical analysis. But as Titus surveyed the corrupted squad, his warriors he had fought beside for decades, now wearing the invisible chains of chaos, he understood that no alternative existed. Either they moved against the Sorcerer with decisive force, or they resigned themselves to watching Graia fall completely to the ruinous powers. The journey to the Temple District became a nightmare progression through a landscape that seemed increasingly hostile to the laws of physics. The ruins that Titus had navigated for days during the Orc campaign had become twisted, stretched, reshaped by forces that existed beyond three-dimensional space. Warriors reported sensory hallucinations, visions of things that should not be, sounds that originated from directions that should have been empty. The Black Carapace helped combat such phenomena, but even augmented minds had limits to what they could process without fracturing. And always, at the periphery of perception, there was the sense of something vast and terrible watching them. The warp itself seemed aware of their presence, almost anticipatory, as if it were relishing the moment when human resistance finally broke beneath the weight of infinite cosmic horror. The Chaos Sorcerer called himself Nemeroth, and when Titus finally confronted him in the heart of what had once been a sacred temple of the Emperor, the revelation was as devastating in its way as any physical assault could have been. Nemeroth was not some utterly alien creature. He was human, or had been, once. Now he was something that transcended such crude categorization, his body festooned with mutations and arcane inscriptions, his form barely constrained by the laws of physics. "The Emperor has abandoned you, Titus," Nemeroth proclaimed, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to bypass Titus's ears entirely and spoke directly into his consciousness. "This world falls to the warp. Your warriors will become our servants, and you who have proven so resistant to our influence, so resistant to the gifts that the gods offer, you will be the greatest trophy of all." Psychic attacks began then, waves of pure force that seemed to originate from outside normal space-time. Titus felt them striking against his consciousness like hammer blows against an anvil. His Black Carapace attempted to process the assault, attempting to translate alien forces into something the human brain could comprehend. But comprehension itself became a weapon. Each attempt to understand the nature of the attack seemed to open new vulnerabilities to the warp's influence. He advanced on Nemeroth regardless, his combat blade held before him as the only reality he could trust. Bolter fire passed through the Sorcerer without effect, physics itself becoming unreliable in the presence of such concentrated warp power. Titus closed the distance through sheer will and determination, understanding that this was no longer a contest that conventional warfare could address. Back at the primary stronghold, Sidonus received word of what was transpiring. The ancient warrior stood at the tactical display, watching the corruption spread across Graia's surface like a stain of impossibility expanding through the material universe. He had lived for centuries, he had served captains who had become legends, and he had seen empires rise and fall. But he had never witnessed anything quite like this. The systematic perversion of reality itself through the power of the warp. "All defensive positions are maintaining," his lieutenant reported. "But Captain, the corruption is accelerating. If this continues, the entire Forge world will be consumed within hours, and there are indications that the breach is expanding beyond Graia's atmosphere. If it reaches the orbital station..." Sidonus did not allow himself to complete that thought. The orbital station housed the only Geller field generator powerful enough to prevent warp incursion across the entire system. If the station fell, if the Geller field collapsed, the corruption would spread like a disease through neighboring worlds. "Prepare a strike team," Sidonus commanded, his ancient voice carrying the weight of absolutely certainty. "We are ascending to the orbital station. If we cannot contain this at the source, we will ensure the contamination does not escape this world." The ascent into orbit, with the very fabric of reality destabilizing around them, was a nightmare journey. The spacecraft seemed to navigate through layers of existence that should not have been physically connected. Sidonus found his augmented perception struggling to maintain coherence as the warp's influence touched the material universe more intimately with each passing moment. And in the Temple District, Titus fought. The duel between Space Marine and Chaos Sorcerer became something beyond mere combat. It was a battle for the very nature of reality itself, fought in a place where physical laws had become negotiable, and consciousness was almost as potent a weapon as blade or bolt. Titus found himself exposed to warp energies that should have driven any normal mind into screaming madness. Visions assaulted him, possible futures where he fell, where chaos triumphed, where the Emperor's Imperium crumbled into dust. All of them simultaneously true and false, existing in superposition until observation collapsed them into singular probability. And then, without warning, the visions stopped. The psychic assaults ceased. Nemeroth retreated, his form dissolving into warp stuff before Titus could deliver a final blow. The sorcerer had achieved whatever objective he had pursued. His ritual work was complete, his gate was opening, and the warp was pouring into Graia with the inevitability of water finding its lowest point. Titus staggered back to the stronghold, his armour scorched by psychic energies that had burned away layers of ceramite in ways that no conventional weapon could achieve. His augmented mind was screaming warnings about exposure to warp-touched forces, but he pushed those warnings aside. There were soldiers to command. There was a world to defend. There was duty. What he found at the stronghold broke something in him that he did not know could be broken. Sidonus lay in the medici chamber, his massive frame shattered by something that conventional medicine could not address. The old warrior's eyes still held clarity, still held the profound understanding of one who had lived long enough to understand the true horror of what they faced. Around him, other warriors lay in similar states, wounded not by physical trauma but by exposure to energies that existed beyond material reality. "Captain," Sidonus whispered, his voice barely audible, "I ordered the ascent to the orbital station. The Gela field will hold, Graia will be contained, the corruption will not spread beyond this world." "You sacrificed yourself," Titus said, kneeling beside his ancient sergeant. The statement was not an accusation, merely a recognition of what he perceived. "We are Space Marines," Sidonus replied, a faint smile crossing his scarred face. "We sacrifice. That is what we are. That is what we have always been. You understand this, Captain. You understand it. Better than most." His ancient eyes closed. "See it through. See Graia through. See the Emperor's will through to its conclusion." Veteran Sergeant Sidonus died as he had lived, in service to the Emperor and the chapter, and in that moment, something crystallized in Titus's consciousness. The corruption, the chaos, the warp itself, all of it had been orchestrated with a precision that suggested intelligence far greater than mere demonic hunger. Someone had planned this invasion. Someone had lured the orcs here, had waited for the Ultramarines to arrive, had orchestrated this entire sequence with the precision of a grand master playing chess across the galaxy. And Titus, in his moment of greatest victory over the orcs, had walked directly into a trap. The warp breach held, barely contained within Graia's atmosphere by the orbital Gela field. The planet was lost, sealed off from the Imperium, its surface now a nightmare realm of warp-touched corruption and impossible geometry. The Ultramarines had preserved the rest of the Imperium from contamination, but the price had been terrible, and Demetrian Titus, who had held the Forge world through tactical brilliance and warrior skill, who had defeated Warboss Grimskull in personal combat, and activated a Warlord Titan through sheer determination, found himself standing amid the ruins of his greatest victory, understanding that greatest victories sometimes contain the seeds of greatest betrayals. The shadows on Graia had begun to move in ways that shadows should not move, and somewhere above, watching through instruments of divine purpose, the Emperor's agents were already reaching conclusions that would change Titus's life forever. Chapter 8. The Final Battle. The ruins of Manufactura Majakis had become something approaching a monument to human hubris. where once massive industrial complexes had stood beneath Graia's perpetually yellow sky, now only twisted metal frameworks remained, their surfaces corroded by exposure to warp-touched energies that should not have existed in the material universe. Demetrian Titus stood atop the highest remaining structure, a tower of ceramite-reinforced concrete that had served as the command centre during the Orc invasion, and surveyed the landscape with the cold clarity of one conducting an autopsy on a world that had already died. The corruption had spread. Measurements indicated that Graia's planetary surface was now nearly 60% affected by warp incursion, with the percentage rising exponentially with each passing hour. The Geller field generated from the orbital station was holding, barely, maintaining a perimeter beyond which the warp could not reach. But it was a temporary solution to a permanent problem. Eventually the field generators would fail. Eventually the corruption would escape into void space. Eventually all of Graia's neighbouring worlds would face the choice between quarantine and contamination. Unless Nemeroth could be stopped. The Chaos Sorcerer had consolidated his power at the heart of the corruption, a location that had once been the Great Temple of the Emperor, the spiritual centre of Graia's faith. Now it was something else entirely, a structure that seemed to exist partially in the warp, its geometry rendering the distance between points into something almost meaningless. Titus's tactical calculations suggested that reaching the Sorcerer would require navigating through terrain, where physics operated under rules that the Black Carapace had no framework to process. He descended from the tower with the fluid grace that his augmentations enabled, meeting with the remainder of his strike team, 7 warriors selected from across the Second Company, each carrying not merely the standard weaponry of Space Marines, but equipment specifically designed to counter warp corruption. Blessed with the Emperor's faith, armoured with prayers etched into their very armour, they represented the finest warriors that could be assembled for such a desperate assault. Brother Captain, one of the warriors, a young warrior named Corvin whose armour still bore the bright gleam of recent consecration, approached with the careful movements of one uncertain whether the ground beneath his feet was entirely stable. The temple is only 2 kilometres distant, yet the sensors indicate the journey will require significant time traversal. Some of the routes through corrupted space appear to move in directions that should not be physically possible. Titus simply nodded, his augmented mind already processing the complexity of what awaited them. The warp did not respect Euclidean geometry. The fundamental structure of reality had been warped, an appropriate term given the nature of the forces at work, into something that bore only surface similarity to normal space. To reach the temple, they would need to navigate through layers of impossible architecture, where distance became negotiable and direction became a matter of faith rather than navigational certainty. "Stay close," Titus commanded, his voice carrying the absolute authority of one who understood that survival now depended on following orders with perfect precision. "Use only sanctified weapons. Fire on nothing that does not show clear signs of hostility, and if you feel your mind beginning to fracture, report it immediately. Exposure to warp energies is a progressive condition. Early recognition may yet allow medic intervention." The journey through the corrupted terrain became a nightmare progression, through landscape that seemed almost alive. Walls existed where they should not exist, then vanished when approaching directly. The sky, where visible through the twisted structures, displayed colours that had no corresponding place in the spectrum of human perception. Worse were the whispers, voices that seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere, speaking in languages that the Black Carapace translated into something approaching intelligibility, yet retained enough of their original alien nature to suggest meanings that human minds could not quite grasp, and the things they encountered. They were not quite demons, not quite corrupted humans, but something existing in the terrible space between categories. They moved through the warp-touched terrain with the ease of creatures that had evolved for this impossible environment. When Titus's strike team encountered them, the warriors responded with the cold precision of Space Marines engaging enemy forces. Bolter fire erupted across the twisted landscape, each shot finding its mark with mathematical certainty, each killed creature collapsing into warp stuff that dissipated like smoke. But for every creature they killed, 2 more seemed to emerge from the corrupted landscape itself. "We're not going to make it through by attrition," Kai reported, his legendary tactical mind processing the mathematics of their situation with cold clarity. "There are too many. We're being slowed down. I believe this is intentional. Nemeroth is attempting to delay our arrival, likely to continue consolidating his power. Titus understood what Kai was suggesting. The direct route was being denied them through sheer numerical attrition. The alternative was to find a route that the sorcerer was not actively defending, which meant trusting to augmented intuition and faith rather than tactical certainty. It was perhaps the most dangerous decision a commander could make, and yet it was also the only decision available. "We move north," Titus announced, altering their trajectory by approximately 40 degrees. "The defensive intensity appears lighter in that direction. It will increase our exposure to raw warp energy, but the reduction in combat encounters should more than compensate." The new route exposed them to phenomena that conventional weapons could not address. Psychic attacks came not as waves of force, but as fundamental revisions of reality. Moments where the warriors found themselves suddenly displaced to locations they did not recognize, where their weapons malfunctioned despite being blessed and maintained with perfect precision, where their very consciousness seemed to slip sideways into states they could not define. Yet they pressed forward. Space Marine training included psychological conditioning designed to resist exactly these kinds of attacks. They had been taught to maintain identity in the face of forces that would unmake that identity, to preserve purpose when purpose itself became questionable. With methodical determination, Titus and his strike team pushed through the impossible terrain. When they finally reached the temple, the sun, a distant point of light barely visible through the corrupted atmosphere, was already descending toward the horizon. How long the journey had taken, Titus could not have said with certainty. Time moved differently in warp-touch terrain. Minutes might have been hours, or hours might have been compressed into minutes. What mattered was that they had arrived. The temple itself was a structure of impossible beauty and profound wrongness. Ancient human architecture had been fused with geometries that no human mind should have conceived, creating something that hurt to perceive directly. Titus found that he had to partially close his visual perception, allowing the black carapace to filter the incoming sensory data through multiple translations before it reached his consciousness proper. And at the center of the temple, atop a dais that seemed to float in space without support, stood Nemeroth. The Chaos Sorcerer had evolved since their last encounter. What had been merely human in form had undergone further mutations, transcendence into something that existed partially outside the material universe. His body seemed to flicker between states, sometimes nearly corporeal, sometimes transparent, sometimes not existing in a form that baseline human perception could recognize at all. "Titus," Nemeroth spoke, and his voice resonated through dimensions beyond 3. "I have anticipated your arrival. I have waited for this moment, knowing that your faith would drive you to this desperate assault. You represent the Imperium's resistance to our gifts, the Emperor's pathetic insistence that humanity has no greater destiny than slavery to a corpse upon a golden throne. I offer you transcendence, I offer you understanding. Join us, and I will make you greater than you have ever been." Titus responded by advancing directly, his bolter already speaking, firing blessed rounds of adamantium and prayer directly into the sorcerer's form. The bullets passed through, Nemeroth without effect, suggesting that the sorcerer existed partially in a dimension that bolter fire could not reach. The battle that followed transcended anything that could be called conventional combat. It was warfare conducted against an enemy that operated according to rules that had nothing to do with the physics that governed baseline material reality. Titus found himself employing tactics that bordered on faith-based rather than logic-based, striking at positions where Nemeroth seemed least prepared, moving in patterns that the sorcerer did not appear to anticipate, fighting with the terrible intensity of one who understood that failure meant not merely death, but transformation into something unrecognizable. And slowly, impossibly, Titus began to gain ground. It was his unusual resistance to warp corruption that proved decisive. Where other Space Marines might have found their consciousness fragmenting under sustained psychic assault, Titus's augmented physiology demonstrated an almost supernatural resilience. The black carapace seemed to filter corruption in ways that shouldn't have been possible, translating attacks designed to break minds into something approaching manageable pain. Nemeroth clearly found this unexpected, the sorcerer's confidence wavering as the moment approached when Material Warrior might overcome Warp-Touch Sorcerer. In the final moment, when Titus's combat blade found the precise point in Nemeroth's flickering form, where material and immaterial existed in greatest equilibrium, the sorcerer made a final gambit. Instead of attempting to escape, Nemeroth released all containment on the warp energies he had been channeling, flooding the temple with raw chaotic force in quantities that should have instantaneously unmade all physical matter in the vicinity. Titus felt it washing over him like an ocean of impossible energy. His black carapace screamed warnings so loudly they bordered on physical pain. His consciousness began to fragment, experiencing multiple versions of reality simultaneously. Versions where he died, versions where he was corrupted, versions where he achieved victory. All of them equally real, equally valid, all of them pressing against his awareness at once. And then, through sheer force of will, he integrated them. His augmented mind forced the multiple probability states to collapse into singular actuality. He chose to survive. He chose to remain intact. He chose to resist the warp itself through the simple act of refusing to acknowledge that resistance was impossible. The Geller field generators overloaded. The temple collapsed into a singularity of warp stuff. The warp breach began to collapse. Nemeroth's form dissipated completely, the sorcerer reduced to nothing more than echoes in dimensions that baseline humans could not perceive. Titus staggered from the temple, his armor scorched by energies that had burned away its sacred blessings, his body barely containing consciousness that kept trying to fragment into multiple states. His strike team gathered around him, all 7 warriors still living, all of them bearing similar marks of exposure to forces that transcended conventional warfare. The corruption halted its advance. The warp breach sealed itself as the power driving it collapsed with Nemeroth's demise. Graia would remain contaminated, sealed off behind the Geller field, an Imperial quarantine world where the warp touched the material universe in ways that could never quite be reversed. But the contamination would not spread. The neighbouring worlds would remain safe. The Imperium would survive. Victory had been achieved. It lasted precisely 4 hours. Titus was conducting casualty assessment when the Vox came alive with a transmission bearing the seal of the Inquisition. The voice that addressed him was cold, precise, utterly without mercy. Captain Demetrian Titus of the Ultramarines 2nd Battle Company. You're hereby placed under arrest for violations of the purity protocols regarding exposure to heretical warp energies. You survived levels of corruption that should have resulted in demonic possession or immediate death. This survival suggests possible heretical augmentation or possession. You will surrender yourself immediately and submit to interrogation for the determination of your loyalty to the Imperium. Resistance will result in immediate execution. Titus felt something crack inside him. Not physically, but something more fundamental. He had survived the impossible. He had defeated a chaos sorcerer. He had saved an entire forge world from corruption. And his reward was accusation and chains. Brother Leandros, standing nearby, his expression unreadable, slowly reached for his sidearm. "Brother," Titus said quietly, understanding the truth with absolute certainty. "You reported my survival to the Inquisition. You reported my resistance to warp corruption as evidence of heresy." "I did what duty required," Leandros replied, his voice steady but carrying the particular tension of one following orders that every human instinct rejected. "Your survival defies every medical protocol. Such resilience can only come from forbidden augmentation or demonic assistance. I could not remain silent." Inquisitor Thrax appeared shortly thereafter, descending from orbital craft with an entourage of judgment-armed servants. He was an ancient warrior, his face bearing the marks of centuries spent rooting out heresy across the Imperium. When he looked at Titus, there was no mercy in that gaze, only the terrible certainty of one conducting the Emperor's work. "You will come with me," Thrax commanded. "The Emperor's justice will determine your fate." Titus lowered his weapon, understanding that resistance would only confirm the accusations already being levelled against him. He allowed himself to be restrained, to be sealed within stasis fields designed to prevent any possible manifestation of corruption. As he was transported to the Inquisition frigate, he looked back at Graia, the world he had saved, now permanently sealed, permanently contaminated. He had survived the impossible, and survival, it seemed, was the greatest crime a space marine could commit. In the darkness of the stasis field, Demetrian Titus, the legend, the hero, the defender of Graia, faced the terrible truth that heroism and loyalty were often sacrificed on the altar of bureaucratic suspicion and fear. The real trial was only beginning. Chapter 9. The Death Watch Years. The interrogation lasted 97 days. Inquisitor Thrax's methods were not crude. They were far too refined for that. He did not employ physical torture, at least not in the traditional sense. Instead, he conducted a systematic deconstruction of everything Titus had believed about himself, using weapons far more lethal than any blade or bolt. Questions designed to undermine certainty, accusations phrased as established facts, evidence presented with a precision that left no room for counter-argument, because the evidence, upon careful examination, existed in states of quantum uncertainty that made definitive refutation impossible. The Black Carapace helped. It allowed Titus to maintain psychological coherence, even as Thrax's interrogation techniques attempted to fragment his consciousness into contradictory states. Yet with each passing day, Titus began to understand the terrible simplicity of his situation. Thrax did not need to prove heresy. He only needed to establish sufficient doubt that the Ultramarines would be forced to accept Titus's removal from the chapter as a prudent measure. And so, after 97 days, a judgment was rendered. Captain Demetrian Titus was not declared a heretic. The evidence was insufficient for such a definitive pronouncement. Instead, he was declared unreliable for continued service within established Astartes frameworks. His unusual resistance to warp corruption suggested either exceptional capability or hidden augmentation. Either possibility made him unsuitable for normal chapter deployment. The Inquisition offered a singular alternative: the Death Watch. The Death Watch was the Emperor's ultimate instrument for dealing with threats that transcended normal military structures. Warriors from across all Space Marine chapters were selected for deployment in kill teams targeting Xenos species that had become sufficiently entrenched or dangerous to warrant the intervention of the Adeptus Astartes' finest warriors. Membership in a Death Watch kill team was considered an honour among most Space Marines. Service was typically limited in duration, rarely exceeding a standard decade of continuous deployment. For Titus, the Death Watch represented something else entirely. He was assigned as a Black Shield, a warrior whose identity was officially erased, who served under the codename Nullus, who was considered expendable in ways that no normal Space Marine could ever be. The message was unmistakable. You may serve the Emperor, but you do so as a servant whose loyalty is perpetually in question. The jungle world of Kadaku became Titus's first major deployment as a Black Shield. The mission was nominally straightforward: eliminate the splinter fleet of Hive Fleet behemoth that had established a breeding nest in the dense jungles covering 70% of Kadaku's surface. In practice, it was a suicide run dressed up in the language of tactical necessity. The splinter fleet had been operating for over a decade, establishing such substantial anchor points in the jungle ecosystem that the Tyranids had achieved effective parity with human defenders in many engagement zones. Casualties were expected to be catastrophic. Titus's kill team consisted of 6 warriors, himself serving as the primary operative, a salamander named Korvax whose expertise in heavy weapons was absolutely legendary, a White Scar designated only as Scout, whose speed and close combat skills were almost supernatural, a member of the Blood Angels whose predatory instincts seemed almost inhumanly acute, a Raven Guard whose tactical assessments bordered on prescient, and finally, the veteran commander, an ancient Ultramarine called Tigurus, who had apparently elected to transfer to permanent Death Watch assignment after his initial deployment term expired. "You are Black Shield Nullus," Tigurus had explained during their first briefing. It was not a question. "Your history is erased, your chapter of origin is irrelevant, your previous accomplishments are forgotten. You exist now only as a tool of the Death Watch, to be deployed, used, and discarded as tactical necessity demands. Many warriors find this difficult to accept. Others find liberation in the simplicity of purpose. I suspect you will be among the latter." The Kadaku campaign lasted 4 standard months. In that time, Titus learned what genuine expendability meant. Kill teams were sent into zones where the Tyranid presence was so overwhelming that retreat was simply not an option. Warriors were deployed in patterns designed not for survival, but for maximum efficiency in the elimination of Xenos threats. The phrase, acceptable casualties, took on meanings that no normal military structure could contemplate. When Korvax took a biomorph's razor-sharp limb through his secondary heart, the team did not retreat. They simply continued the mission, while the Salamander's dying consciousness transmitted targeting information to Tigurus for final fire missions. Yet in this crucible of despair and sacrifice, something extraordinary began to occur. Titus discovered that the acceptance of his own expendability paradoxically freed him from fear. When he had been the legendary captain of the 2nd Battle Company, his decisions had carried weight. Thousands of warriors depended upon his tactical brilliance, his leadership. That responsibility had been simultaneously motivating and constraining. As Black Shield Nullus, he had no such burden. He could act with perfect tactical clarity because the consequences of failure affected no one but himself. His kill team depended on him, yes, but not on Titus the legendary warrior. They depended on the tactical competence of Nullus, the expendable operative. If he died, another Black Shield would be assigned. If he succeeded, it was merely another mission completed. The clarity was intoxicating in a way that heroism had never been. During the final weeks of the Kadaku campaign, when the Splinter Fleet had been driven to near extinction, Tigurus approached Titus in private. The ancient Ultramarines' weathered face carried an expression that suggested he possessed knowledge that was ordinarily forbidden to Black Shields. "I knew you before you became Nullus," Tigurus said simply. "I was present during the debriefing after Graia. I reviewed Thrax's case against you." He paused, his ancient eyes studying Titus with an intensity that seemed to penetrate far deeper than mere physical observation. "I believe the Inquisitor was fundamentally mistaken. Your resistance to warp corruption is not evidence of heresy. It is evidence of something far rarer. You possess a natural gift for existing in states of psychological and spiritual equilibrium that most warriors must achieve through years of psychological conditioning. It makes you dangerous to bureaucratic structures that require predictability. It does not make you heretical." "Your opinion is irrelevant," Titus replied, though something in his tone suggested the statement was not entirely true. "The judgment has been rendered. I am Nullus. I exist to serve." "Yes," Tigurus agreed, "and you are serving with a dedication and effectiveness that exceeds even chapter standards. Do you understand what that means? It means you are capable of redemption. It means that if you survive the next phase of your assignment, if you endure what is coming, there may be a path forward that does not require you to accept permanent exile." What Tigurus was suggesting was dangerous territory. The Death Watch's purpose was not to provide paths to redemption. It was to provide a framework for warriors whose loyalty was questioned but whose skill was undeniable. Yet over the following years, as Titus undertook mission after mission, the Genestealers of Hive Fleet Kraken, the Elder Corsairs of Port Suffering, the rogue trader slavers who employed Orc mercenaries, he began to understand that Tigurus's suggestion, while dangerous, was not entirely unfounded. Slowly, methodically, through the accumulation of successful missions and the demonstrated reliability of his service, Titus began to rebuild what had been destroyed. Not his identity as captain, that door had been permanently closed, but something else, a kind of spiritual redemption that came not from external validation, but from the perfect alignment between purpose and action. He was Nullus. He was expendable. And in accepting that fundamental truth, he had found something approaching peace. Years passed, 5, then 10, then 15. Titus watched kill team brothers come and go, watched younger warriors develop their own capabilities, watched the Death Watch transform through the application of tactical lessons learned through centuries of anti-Xenos warfare. He remained, he endured, he served. It was during his 19th year of service as a Black Shield that the message came. "You are being reassigned," Tigurus informed him, his ancient face showing signs of fatigue that even centuries of service had not prepared him to overcome. "The Death Watch has determined that continued Black Shield assignment is inappropriate for your skill level. The Chapter Master of the Ultramarines has formally requested your return for a special operation. The Inquisition has acquiesced to this request." Titus felt something shift within his consciousness. Not quite relief, but perhaps recognition that one phase of his existence had concluded and another was beginning. "What awaits me?" "Resurrection," Tigurus replied simply, "or final judgment. Perhaps both. Either way, you have served the Emperor with honor. Black Shield Nullus. You have earned redemption, whether the institutional structures recognize it or not. That must be sufficient." As Titus departed the Death Watch Fortress Monastery, Leaving behind the identity of Nullus to face an uncertain future, he found himself reflecting on the fundamental strangeness of his journey. He had been elevated to legendary status as captain of the Second Company. That elevation had resulted in betrayal and exile. In exile, he had found something approaching true peace through the acceptance of worthlessness. And now, having accepted his own insignificance, he was being called back to significance. The Emperor's plan, if indeed such a singular entity as the Emperor's plan could be said to exist, operated according to principles that human consciousness could barely grasp. Titus had spent 19 years learning to accept that he might be mistaken about everything: his past, his future, his fundamental nature. That acceptance, paradoxically, was perhaps the only foundation upon which genuine service could be built. He did not know what awaited him upon his return to the Ultramarines. He did not know if he would be restored to captain rank or relegated to permanent servitor-like duty. He did not know if the Inquisition's acquiescence was genuine or merely another form of long-term strategic manipulation. What he did know was that he had survived. He had endured. And if the Emperor desired further service from Demetrian Titus, whatever that service might entail, he was prepared to undertake it with the clarity and acceptance that only one who had been broken and reconstructed could possess. The void stretched before his transport, infinite points of light marking worlds whose futures he would help to determine or defend. Blackshield Nullus was dead. In his place stood only a warrior, stripped of rank, stripped of identity, stripped of everything except the fundamental capacity to serve. And perhaps in the grim darkness of the far future, that was the greatest honour that any warrior could be offered. Chapter 10. The Resurrection. The apothecary vessel, a massive orbital platform orbiting Macragge in perfect geosynchronous alignment with the fortress of Hera, had been designed with singular purpose: the elevation of worthy space marines into Primaris status. The process was something between rebirth and resurrection, a transformation so fundamental that it transcended even the remarkable metamorphosis that had created baseline space marines from human stock. Chief Librarian Tigurus stood at the viewing portal of the Medkey chamber, his augmented mind processing the medical data flowing across the monitoring systems with mathematical precision. Titus lay upon the surgical platform below, his body already suspended in the initial phases of the Rubicon Primaris procedure, a process that made even the original black carapace implantation seem like preliminary conditioning. His medical profile remains exceptional, Tigurus reported to the assembled chapter staff attending the procedure. However, I must once again emphasize the experimental nature of this authorization. Captain Titus has been designated a Black Shield for 19 years. Restoration to full chapter status, combined with immediate elevation to Primaris rank, represents a concatenation of decisions that existing doctrine does not adequately address. Chapter Master Marneus Calgar, standing with the quiet authority that had guided the Ultramarines through 10,000 years of history, regarded Tigurus with eyes that suggested he had anticipated such concerns and dismissed them as irrelevant. Chief Librarian, Calgar responded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute command authority. Demetrian Titus survived exposure to warp forces that should have driven any normal consciousness into fragmentation. He served 19 years in the Death Watch without a single documented psychological breakdown. He has demonstrated loyalty through the most severe possible testing. That he was subjected to false accusation by the Inquisition is something I intend to address through proper channels once this procedure is complete. But first, I will restore him to full service. The Emperor requires such warriors. There was something in Calgar's tone, a certainty that transcended mere military command, that suggested this decision was not merely tactical necessity, but something approaching faith. The chapter master had reviewed Thrax's case against Titus extensively, had spent hours in meditation before the Golden Throne itself had apparently reached conclusions that no external evidence could have produced. Begin the secondary implantations, Calgar commanded, and the surgical teams descended toward Titus's unconscious form with the precision of warriors who had performed this ritual dozens of times before. The Primaris transformation required physical and psychological changes that even the black carapace had never contemplated. Additional muscle tissue was grafted in, not merely augmented but fundamentally redesigned according to specifications that the Primaris procedure enabled. The cardiovascular system was enhanced, the skeletal structure reinforced with substances that made even ceramite armor seem brittle by comparison. Most profoundly, the neural architecture was expanded, upgrading the Black Carapace to interface with processing capabilities that far exceeded even Space Marine norms. Titus experienced none of this with his conscious mind, but in the depths of his sedated consciousness, something was registering the profound metamorphosis occurring. Dreams came, visions of battles that had not yet occurred, of enemies not yet encountered, of futures that existed in probability states that should have been inaccessible to human perception. The Black Carapace was being expanded, elevated, transformed into something that bore only ancestral similarity to the original implant. The surgical process lasted 74 hours. When Titus emerged from the Medici chamber, the first thing he noticed was the weight. His enhanced musculature had increased by approximately 40%, yet paradoxically, his new augmentations made that weight feel more natural, more integrated with his fundamental sense of self. Moving through the chamber felt different. His new neural architecture was processing spatial data with enhanced precision, allowing movements that bordered on supernatural grace even by Space Marine standards. Master Apothecary Solus, still conducting final examinations, regarded Titus with the clinical assessment of one who had overseen dozens of Primaris transformations. How do you perceive the changes? Titus took a moment to catalogue the sensory input flooding through his expanded neural architecture. I am experiencing approximately 3 times the sensory processing capability of my previous augmentation baseline. The new implementations are integrating smoothly with existing mental frameworks. Psychological coherence is maintained. I believe I am functional. More than functional, Solus replied, a faint smile crossing his ancient face. You've integrated the Primaris enhancements with remarkable speed. Most newly elevated warriors require weeks to achieve full neural adaptation. You appear to be approaching it within hours. It suggests either exceptional psychological baseline or the early stages of unprecedented enhancement. We will monitor your development closely. It was Calgar himself who delivered the official restoration of rank. The chapter master stood in the vast cathedral of the Fortress of Hera, the same chapel where Titus had first sworn oaths to the Emperor centuries before, when he was merely a young warrior ascending into the ranks of the Second Company. Calgar's bearing was that of one conducting not merely a military reassignment, but a sacred ritual. Demetrian Titus, Calgar pronounced, his voice resonating through the cathedral with the weight of absolute authority. I hereby restore you to full service within the Ultramarines chapter. Your exile is ended. Your name is restored. Your past is sealed and designated irrelevant to your future service. Before you stands the Imperium's recognition that you have endured what lesser warriors could not have borne. You have been tested in ways that transcend military doctrine. You have proven yourself worthy of redemption. Calgar paused, his gaze meeting Titus's directly. Something passed between them in that moment. Not mere military hierarchy, but recognition of something deeper. The chapter master understood something about Titus that bureaucratic structures could never capture. He understood that this warrior represented a bridge between acceptable doctrine and the extraordinary capabilities that the Imperium desperately required. Furthermore, Calgar continued, you are hereby elevated to Primaris status and assigned to command the newly formed Second Primaris Company. You will rebuild the company structure according to your own tactical assessments. You will implement whatever doctrinal improvements you have learned during your Deathwatch service, and you will demonstrate to the broader Imperium that the Ultramarines remain the finest warriors the Emperor has ever created. Do you accept this responsibility? Titus felt something crack open within his consciousness, not in the sense of breaking, but in the sense of a pod splitting to release something new. He had spent 19 years as Nullus, convinced that his identity had been permanently erased. He had accepted that exile and loss were his permanent state, and now, suddenly, he was being offered restoration on terms that transcended his understanding. I accept, Chapter Master, Titus replied, his voice steady despite the cascade of emotions flowing through his consciousness. I will serve the Emperor and the Chapter with renewed dedication. I will honour the trust you have placed in me by ensuring that every warrior under my command receives the training and discipline necessary to achieve excellence. Then we are finished here, Calgar said, his expression suggesting something approaching satisfaction. Go, meet your new company. Let them understand that they serve under one who has been tested by the very forces that the Imperium fears most, and who has endured those tests without breaking. That will inspire them more than any decoration or honour ever could. In the hours that followed, Titus ascended to the barracks complex where his newly formed company was assembled. The warriors were Primaris, taller, more heavily augmented, representing the Imperium's next evolution in Space Marine capability. Yet when Titus addressed them, something in his bearing immediately commanded attention. These warriors were enhanced, but they had not yet endured the particular crucible that decades of combined combat and psychological trial had forged. "I will not speak to you of glorious victory," Titus told the assembled warriors, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won experience. "Victory is the expectation. What I will speak to you of is the reality that lies beneath that expectation. The reality that every battle is a moment where we risk everything, that every decision we make carries consequences measured in the lives of our brothers, that perfection is impossible but must always be pursued. You are Primaris. You represent the Emperor's will made manifest in enhanced form, and because of that, you will be tested more severely than perhaps any warriors before you. I intend to ensure that when those tests come, you are prepared not merely to survive, but to endure with honour intact." The warriors accepted this assessment without resistance. There was something in Titus's bearing, the particular quality of one who had been broken and reconstructed, that transcended mere command authority and spoke directly to something deeper. These warriors understood instinctively that their new commander had walked paths that most would never contemplate, had endured trials that would have destroyed lesser beings. In his quarters that evening, Titus found himself standing before a mirror, contemplating the reflection that gazed back. The physical changes from the Primaris transformation were obvious. Enhanced musculature, the particular bearing that only Primaris warriors possessed, the subtle luminescence of augmented eyes that processed reality through multiple sensory spectra. But beneath those physical changes was something more fundamental. He was transformed, but he was still Demetrian Titus, the person who had existed before the exile remained, but now integrated with the experience of Black Shield Nullus. He thought briefly of Sidnus, the ancient sergeant who had guided him through the trials that had eventually led to his fall. The old warrior had been correct. There had indeed been a path toward redemption, though that path had required enduring the very punishment that righteous institutions had deemed necessary. He thought of Graia, the world he had saved, now permanently sealed behind a Geller field, a quarantine zone where human explorers would never again walk without protective measures. His victory there had been real, even if it had been immediately followed by betrayal and exile. Most profoundly, he thought of the 19 years as Black Shield Nullus, when he had believed his true identity to be permanently erased. In accepting that loss, in serving with total dedication despite believing himself permanently fallen, he had somehow found something approaching redemption. It was not the redemption of return to his previous status. Something in his experience in the Death Watch had changed him too profoundly for simple restoration. It was, rather, the redemption of understanding that identity and purpose could exist independently, that service could be genuine and meaningful, even when stripped of all external validation. The golden sun of Macree was setting over the horizon, casting long shadows across the fortress of Hera that seemed to move like living things. Titus stood at the viewport, contemplating the stellar panorama beyond, infinite points of light marking worlds whose futures he would help to determine. He was restored, he was elevated, he was returned to service, but not quite to the person he had been before. He was something new, a synthesis of legendary captain and expendable Black Shield, tempered by decades of exile and service into an instrument more potent than either state could have created alone. The real trials, Titus understood with absolute certainty, were only beginning. The Thousand Suns were pressing their offensives, Tyranid fleets were darkening the void, heretical forces gathered in the shadows, and now, wearing Primaris armour that marked him as one of the Imperium's newest evolution in warfare, Demetrian Titus prepared to face those threats. He was no longer the fallen captain awaiting judgment. He was no longer the expendable Black Shield seeking redemption through service. He was something that transcended both categories, a warrior reborn, transformed through suffering into something greater than he had ever been before. And for the first time since his arrest on Graia, Titus allowed himself to experience something approaching genuine hope. Chapter 11, Reclamation and Resolve. The first indication that full integration would not be as simple as restoration came during a routine training scenario with the 2nd Primaris Company. Titus was conducting basic tactical drills, nothing particularly complex, merely standard formations designed to establish baseline cohesion among warriors who had never fought together as a unified force. Yet 3 hours into the scenario, Brother Callan, one of the newer Primaris warriors, approached him with visible uncertainty etched into his bearing. "Captain," Callan said, his movements hinting at the careful deliberation of one uncertain about his welcome to speak. "The tactical formations you are implementing differ significantly from standard Primaris doctrine. Your deployment pattern suggests simultaneous defense and aggressive positioning that creates overlapping fire lanes. By conventional analysis, this creates moments of vulnerability." Titus studied the young warrior, recognizing the particular quality of uncertainty that suggested Callan was not challenging doctrine, but rather attempting to understand tactical reasoning that transcended conventional frameworks. "You're correct in your observation," Titus replied, his enhanced Primaris senses already processing the underlying question Callan had not quite verbalized. "Standard Primaris doctrine was designed in consideration of warriors with your baseline capabilities. However, my experience in the Death Watch taught me that doctrine itself is sometimes the enemy of effective warfare. There are moments when overlapping fire lanes create zones of optimal vulnerability precisely because enemy predictability assumes such zones will be avoided. We exploit that predictability by occupying the very positions that doctrine declares indefensible." "But what of casualties?" Callan persisted, and something in his tone suggested genuine concern rather than mere adherence to regulations. "If the doctrine is correct that such positions are vulnerable, then our warriors will suffer increased casualties." "Yes," Titus acknowledged simply. "And that is the fundamental truth of warfare that neither doctrine nor training can adequately prepare warriors to accept. Every tactical decision involves calculating acceptable casualties. The question is not how to eliminate casualties entirely, that is impossible, but how to ensure that the casualties incurred achieve objectives worthy of their sacrifice." The conversation spread through the company ranks, as Titus had perhaps intended it would. Questions began to surface during training scenarios, not challenges to his authority, but genuine attempts to understand why their new commander's tactical assessments often violated established protocols. Titus found himself conducting something approaching philosophical seminars, attempting to articulate the hard-won lessons of centuries of combat through dialogue with warriors who had never experienced genuine warfare. It was challenging in ways that pure military command had never been, because it required him to articulate intuitions that had become almost automatic through experience. One evening, after a particularly intensive training session, Titus discovered himself in conversation with a warrior named Korvac, who carried himself with unusual caution despite possessing impressive combat credentials, even by Primaris standards. "You were involved in the Graia campaign," Korvac stated, not as question but as observation grounded in knowledge he had clearly researched. "You achieved victory, yet the aftermath resulted in your arrest and exile. Now you have been restored. The company speaks about this in quiet moments. Some believe you were wrongly accused. Others suggest that the very nature of your restoration indicates acknowledgement of error by higher authority. What should we believe?" Titus felt something shift within his consciousness. The weight of a question that cut to the fundamental uncertainty he still harboured despite Calga's restoration. Did he truly believe he had been wrongly accused? Or had he simply learned to accept injustice as part of the fundamental fabric of Imperial structure? "What you should believe," Titus replied carefully, "is that justice in the Imperium is often imprecise. I survived warp exposure that should have destroyed my consciousness. That survival was presented as evidence of heresy or hidden corruption. In a different context, the same survival might have been presented as proof of exceptional faith. The Inquisition made a judgment based on incomplete data. I accepted that judgment and served my exile with the same dedication I had previously served the chapter. Eventually, the chapter master judged my service worthy of restoration. None of these judgments were necessarily wrong. They were simply applications of doctrine to circumstances that doctrine was not designed to address." "That is not an answer," Korvac said quietly. "That is acceptance without understanding." "Yes," Titus agreed. and sometimes acceptance without understanding is the only form of wisdom available to warriors in service to an institution vastly older and more complex than our individual comprehension can encompass. The months that followed were occupied with the gradual integration of doctrine adaptation and warrior development. Titus implemented tactical innovations learned during Deathwatch service, but did so carefully, ensuring that each deviation from established protocols was explained and justified through demonstrable results. The second Primaris company began to develop a reputation for tactical flexibility, unusual among Astartes formations, the ability to maintain standard doctrinal approaches while simultaneously remaining prepared to radically alter strategy when circumstances demanded. Most importantly, the company developed something that transcended mere tactical competence. There was a particular quality to their training sessions, an absence of the rigid adherence to protocol that sometimes characterized other Astartes formations. Titus's warriors understood that they served under a commander who had been tested, broken, and reconstructed, and who used that experience to demand excellence while simultaneously accepting the inevitable failures that accompanied ambitious tactical implementation. It was during a private briefing with Chief Librarian Tigurus that the final piece of integration occurred. Tigurus arrived at Titus's command quarters bearing data slates that suggested significant effort had been invested in their compilation. The ancient Ultramarines' expression carried something approaching satisfaction mixed with the particular quality of one bearing important news. "The formal records have been sealed," Tigurus announced, settling into a chair across from Titus's tactical display. "Your exile status has been officially retracted. More importantly, Inquisitor Thrax has been redirected. His pursuit of evidence suggesting your heresy has been deemed inconclusive. Officially, there is no record that any of this occurred. You have been restored to full status, your rank is permanent, and you're now considered a valued asset to the Ultramarines chapter." And unofficially, Titus asked, understanding that Tigurus's phrasing indicated additional context that required explicit articulation. Unofficially, Chapter Master Calgar has submitted significant evidence that your survival of warp exposure is not evidence of heresy, but rather evidence of a natural capability that the Imperium desperately requires. The Primaris elevation was designed not merely as reward for endured exile, but as enhancement of capabilities that bureaucratic structures had previously attempted to suppress. The Emperor's work proceeds in mysterious ways, and sometimes that work requires manipulating institutional structures toward outcomes that benefit the Imperium, even if those outcomes are not immediately obvious to the practitioners of such manipulation. Tigurus paused, his ancient eyes studying Titus with the particular intensity of one reading something written in layers of meaning beneath surface presentation. "You survived the impossible, Titus. You endured exile with dignity. You have been restored with honor. None of that changes the fundamental uncertainty that will likely plague you for the remainder of your service. The question of whether you were guilty or innocent, whether justice was served or perverted, whether your restoration represents redemption, or merely institutional acknowledgement of error. The Imperium offers no certainty on such matters. It offers only the opportunity for continued service, and the hope that continued service will eventually demonstrate which interpretation of your journey was correct." Over the following years, as campaigns unfolded and the Second Primaris Company demonstrated increasing tactical excellence, Titus began to understand something profound about the nature of redemption and restoration. It was not a binary state that could be achieved and then maintained in permanent form. Instead, it was an ongoing process, a constant process of proving through action that restoration was justified, that the faith Calgar had invested was not misplaced. The Thousand Suns pressed their offensives into Imperial space, and the Second Primaris Company responded with tactical innovations that turned what appeared to be inevitable defeats into complex stalemates. Tyrannid splinter fleets were encountered and contained through combinations of defensive brilliance and aggressive counterattack. Heretical forces that sought to exploit Imperial vulnerability found themselves facing warriors who had learned through years of Deathwatch service how to engage enemies that defied conventional warfare logic. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, something shifted in how the company regarded their commander. The wariness that had initially characterized their response to a leader who had been stripped of rank and then restored evolved into something approaching genuine respect. These warriors understood through their own experience under Titus's command that the scars of his journey had not broken him, but had instead refined him into an instrument of terrible effectiveness. It was during the campaign against the Thousand Suns Enclave on Port Obsidian that the final reconciliation occurred, not with the institution that had accused him or the chapter that had restored him, but with himself. Titus stood over the corpse of a Thousand Suns sorcerer who had dared to engage the Second Primaris Company in direct combat. Around him, the battlefield demonstrated the company's devastating effectiveness. Heretical forces routed, objectives achieved, minimal friendly casualties despite the overwhelming opposition. Victory had been achieved through tactics that would have been declared impractical by conventional doctrine, but which had proven devastatingly effective through implementation. In that moment, standing amid the aftermath of triumph that existed within the context of service, Titus understood that the question of whether he had been guilty or innocent on Graia had ceased to matter. What mattered was that he had survived. What mattered was that he had endured. What mattered was that he continued to serve with dedication and excellence, regardless of whether that service was occurring as a rewarded hero or as tolerated black shield. The fundamental truth of his journey crystallized in his consciousness with absolute clarity. He had been tested beyond the breaking point. He had broken. He had been reconstructed. And in the process of reconstruction, he had become something more profound than either the legendary captain or the expendable black shield could have created alone. He was a synthesis, a warrior whose understanding transcended comfortable certainty and ventured into the harder truths of service and sacrifice. That evening, Titus wrote a personal commendation for each member of the Second Primaris Company, not for their tactical brilliance or martial prowess, but for their willingness to follow a commander whose past was marked by betrayal and exile, and whose future remained uncertain. It was the first time since his restoration that he had explicitly acknowledged the journey that had brought him to this moment, and in the acknowledgement, something finally released. Not forgiveness exactly, but acceptance of the fundamental complexity of his own story. When Brother Korvac approached him during the evening meal, his bearing carried none of the earlier uncertainty. "Captain," Korvac said simply, "I believe now that I understand. There was no single moment of justice or injustice. There was only an ongoing process in which you and the institution mutually tested each other, seeking to determine truth through application of increasingly severe trials. Those trials have concluded, for now at least, and what has been revealed through those trials is sufficient." "Sufficient for what?" Titus asked, though he suspected he understood the answer. "Sufficient for service," Korvac replied. "Sufficient for belief. Sufficient for the kind of loyalty that transcends institutional structure and ventured into something approaching genuine faith. That, I think, is the redemption you have earned. Not vindication for past accusations, but the transformation of doubt into something resembling certainty through sustained demonstration of unwavering commitment to excellence." Titus nodded slowly, recognizing in Korvac's words the articulation of truth that had been gestating within his own consciousness for months. He had sought vindication for wrongs committed during the Graia campaign. Instead, he had received something more valuable, the opportunity to prove through action that vindication was irrelevant, that what mattered was not whether past accusations had been justified, but whether future service could be rendered with perfect dedication despite that uncertainty. In accepting that frame of reference, in moving from defensive vindication-seeking into proactive excellence demonstrating, Titus had finally completed the process that exile had begun. He was no longer defending his past. He was claiming his future through the only means available to a warrior, through the quality of his continued service to the Emperor and the chapter. The scars remained. The memory of betrayal remained. The fundamental uncertainty about his nature and capabilities remained. But overlaying all of that was a hard-won peace that came not from external validation, but from internal integration of experiences that had seemed fragmentary and incoherent into a narrative of purpose and meaning. Demetrian Titus, the legendary captain, the fallen warrior, the Black Shield in exile, the restored Primaris Lieutenant, all of these identities existed simultaneously within the consciousness of a warrior who had finally learned to accept the complexity of his own journey as a source of strength rather than shame. Chapter 12. The Eternal Warrior. The Bridge of the Battle Barge. Resolute defiance felt smaller than it had when Titus had first assumed command of the vessel, or perhaps the weight of centuries of service had simply compressed his perception of space into something that no mere physical dimension could adequately capture. He stood at the primary viewport, his Primaris enhanced form casting long shadows across the deck plates, shadows that seemed to move with their own autonomous will, as though the darkness of the void beyond the hull was reaching inward, eager to remind him of the infinite emptiness that lay beyond the fragile protection of adamantium and blessed generators. The amber glow of the cogitator screens bathed his face in warm light, a particular quality of illumination that had become more familiar than any planetary sun could ever be. Titus breathed deeply, drawing in the recycled air of the ship with its faint hint of machine oils and the subtle musk of human habitation that no filtration system could ever quite eliminate. This was home now, had been for decades, would likely remain so for the centuries still ahead of him. A ship, a command, warriors who trusted his judgment despite knowing nothing of his journey except what demonstrated itself through action. Behind him, the tactical display showed the current deployment pattern of the Second Primaris Company across 3 separate theatre engagements. The Thousand Suns were pressing their offensives into the Cadia sector, heretical forces were consolidating around the demon worlds of the warp-touched region, and Tyrannid splinter fleets continued their evolutionary assault against Imperial strongholds. Warfare, in all its terrible complexity, proceeded according to patterns that had been established 10,000 years prior and showed no signs of evolving beyond the fundamental mathematics of conflict and sacrifice. Titus had stood at tactical displays such as this for approximately 400 years. The specific numbers changed. Different worlds, different enemies, different warriors under his command, but the essential pattern remained constant. Threats emerged. Warriors were deployed. Some emerged victorious, some did not emerge at all. And the Imperium endured because the Imperium was constructed upon the principle that individual survival was irrelevant compared to institutional continuation. It was a truth that Titus had spent the first 200 years of his service resisting, and the subsequent 200 years learning to accept. Chief Librarian Tigurus, now so ancient that his augmented body seemed to exist primarily through technological support systems, approached with movements that suggested every gesture required conscious effort. The old warrior's mind remained sharp despite the physical degradation that even centuries of Adeptus Astartes physiology could not entirely prevent. The Thousand Suns continue their offensive patterns, Tigurus reported, his voice carrying the precise enunciation of one who had conducted similar briefings 10,000 times. However, I have been reviewing the strategic movements more carefully, and I believe I perceive something underneath the apparent chaos. The offensive is not random, it is focused. The Thousand Suns are not attempting to conquer Cadia, they are attempting something more subtle. They are seeking to draw maximum Imperial response, to test our tactical capabilities and strategic reserves. In essence, they are evaluating us, testing what we have learned since their last major offensive. Titus processed this assessment with the calm clarity that centuries of command experience had provided. Tigurus's observation was likely accurate. The Chief Librarian's tactical prescience had rarely failed in matters of strategic significance, which meant the Imperium was being tested, being evaluated by forces that sought to determine what threats represented genuine danger and what represented acceptable losses in the greater struggle for reality itself. "Your recommendation?" Titus asked, though he suspected he understood the answer. "We must respond not to the Thousand Suns' apparent strategy, but to their underlying purpose," Tigurus replied. "We must demonstrate capabilities that exceed their expectations. We must show them that the Imperium has learned from previous encounters that we are not merely responding to threats but anticipating them. In essence, we must make them fear us more than they currently do." It was a simple enough principle, yet one that required flawless execution by warriors operating at the absolute peak of their capabilities. And Titus understood, with the clarity that comes from centuries of experience, that this was perhaps the final truth underlying all military doctrine, that warfare was ultimately about psychological determination expressed through physical means. The warrior who could impose their will most effectively, who could demonstrate capability more convincingly, who could sustain effort longer and with greater precision, that warrior would prevail regardless of the technical sophistication of weapons or the brilliance of tactical planning. The second Primaris company had been trained to understand this principle. They had been taught through experience and hardship to distinguish between fighting for victory and fighting for the preservation of purpose. And so, when Titus issued orders for the company to undertake an assault directly into Thousand Sons strongholds rather than meeting them on defensible ground, the warriors accepted those orders without question. They understood that their commander was operating at a level of strategic sophistication that transcended conventional doctrinal frameworks. 3 days later, standing amid the smoking ruins of what had been a Thousand Sons enclave on the forge world of Telios Prime, Titus found himself contemplating the nature of victory and the weight that victory carried across centuries. The company had prevailed, as they typically did. The Thousand Sons had been routed, their stronghold destroyed, their strategic position in the region fundamentally degraded. By every objective measure, it had been a success. Yet as Titus surveyed the battlefield, watching his warriors conduct post-engagement recovery operations, he felt something more complex than mere satisfaction. What he experienced was recognition of a pattern that had repeated itself hundreds of times across 4 centuries of service: victory, consolidation, brief respite, new threats emerging, preparation for the next engagement, an eternal cycle that would continue until the Imperium itself collapsed under the weight of the forces arrayed against it, or until the Emperor's will somehow manifested itself in a way that transcended military conflict. In the quiet of his private quarters aboard the Resolute Defiance, Titus found himself reviewing records of his service, centuries of combat reports, strategic assessments, casualty counts, and tactical innovations. The data was staggering in its volume, incomprehensible in its complexity. Thousands upon thousands of warriors had served under his command across the centuries. Millions had been trained by his methodologies. Countless worlds had been defended by implementations of his tactical doctrines. And yet, when Titus reviewed the fundamental nature of his service, it reduced itself to something approaching simplicity. He had survived. He had endured. He had maintained faith in the Emperor and the chapter even when that faith seemed unjustified. And in maintaining faith through suffering, he had somehow become what the Imperium desperately required. Not a warrior who was certain of his righteousness, but one who had learned to act decisively despite fundamental uncertainty about the nature of truth and justice. It was perhaps the most profound lesson that his exile and restoration had provided. The Imperium did not require warriors who possessed absolute moral clarity. It required warriors who could function effectively despite that clarity being permanently obscured by the fog of institutional complexity and the terrible reality of choices where every option was morally ambiguous. A communication arrived as evening descended across the fortress monastery, bearing the seal of Chapter Master Calgar. The ancient warrior, now so old that even the superior physiology of Space Marines was approaching the limits of its capability, requested Titus's presence for a private consultation. When they met in Calgar's private chambers, overlooking the vast training complexes of the Fortress of Hera, the Chapter Master's first words suggested something beyond routine military business. "You have served for 403 years, Calgar began without preamble, his ancient eyes studying Titus with the particular intensity of one reading something written in layers of meaning beneath surface. Presentation. "You have led this second Primaris company through engagements that would have broken lesser warriors. You have implemented tactical innovations that have been adopted across the entire chapter. You have mentored hundreds of warriors who now carry your doctrines forward into their own commands. And in all of that service, despite the extraordinary achievement, you have remained fundamentally unchanged in one critical aspect." "Which is?" Titus asked, though he suspected he understood the answer. "You remain uncertain of your own nature," Calgar replied. "You question whether your warp resistance represents gift or curse. You wonder whether your restoration was justified or merely institutional recognition of error. You doubt whether the Inquisition was correct in its accusation, or whether you were wrongly condemned. In essence, you have never achieved the absolute certainty that would allow you to rest." "Is such certainty possible?" Titus responded. "No," Calgar said simply. "And that is the revelation that you have discovered across 4 centuries, that the Imperium does not require certainty. It requires warriors who can function effectively despite uncertainty, who can maintain faith despite the constant erosion of that faith by reality's indifference, who can continue to serve despite understanding that service might ultimately be meaningless. You represent everything the Imperium most desperately needs, precisely because you have accepted that you might be mistaken about everything. The chapter master paused, his gaze drifting toward the view screen where the stars of the Imperium could be seen, infinite points of light marking worlds where warriors were currently engaged in struggles that would likely be forgotten within a generation. "I do not know if you were guilty of heresy on Graia," Calgar continued. "I don't know if your warp resistance represents corruption or exceptional faith. I do not know if your restoration was justice or institutional manipulation. What I know is that you have served the Emperor and the chapter with unwavering dedication for 4 centuries. That dedication is sufficient. Your doubt has become your strength, and your uncertainty has become your greatest asset." In the weeks that followed Calgar's pronouncement, Titus began to understand something profound about the nature of legacy and meaning in the Imperium of Man. He was not a hero in the traditional sense. Heroes were warriors who possessed absolute moral clarity and acted upon that clarity with unquestioning determination. Titus was something else entirely. He was a warrior who had been broken by uncertainty and reconstructed despite that breaking. He was a leader who functioned effectively precisely because he questioned himself continuously. He was a living example of the possibility that strength could emerge not from confidence, but from the acceptance of fundamental doubt. The Thousand Suns continued their offensive. Tyrannid, fleets darkened the void, heretical forces consolidated in the shadows, and the Imperium endured, defended by warriors who understood that victory was temporary and defeat was always a possibility, yet who fought with absolute dedication despite, or perhaps because of, that understanding. Titus stood at the viewport of the Resolute Defiance, watching as new tactical data streamed across the displays, indicating new threats requiring immediate response. He felt the weight of 4 centuries of service, the memory of countless warriors who had served under his command and fallen to Xenos weapons or heretical treachery. He felt the uncertainty that had never quite been resolved, the questions about his own nature that would likely remain unanswered until his consciousness finally ceased to function. And in the acceptance of all that, the weight, the loss, the uncertainty, Titus found what might have been approaching peace. The red sun of Tarentus was impossibly distant now, separated from this moment by 400 years and the distance of approximately 10,000 light-years. The Agri-World child who had once yearned for something greater than soil and harvest had evolved into a warrior legendary across the chapter, yet that child's hunger remained. Not for glory or vindication, but for the opportunity to serve with excellence, to lead warriors toward objectives worthy of their sacrifice, to maintain the defense of the Imperium despite understanding that all defenses were ultimately temporary. In the grim darkness of the far future, there was war. There would always be war. And the Emperor's servants would continue to serve, not because victory was assured, but because the act of service itself became the only form of meaning available to those who had accepted the universe's fundamental indifference to human survival or success. Demetrian Titus, the legendary captain, the fallen warrior, the Black Shield in exile, the restored Primaris Lieutenant, the eternal commander, all of these identities existed simultaneously within consciousness that had been forged through suffering into an instrument capable of functioning with perfect dedication despite fundamental doubt about its own nature. He issued new orders to the Second Primaris Company. The warriors responded with the discipline born of centuries of collective service. The battle barge adjusted its course toward new engagements, new threats, new opportunities to demonstrate the strength that the Imperium desperately required. And in the spaces between engagements, in the brief moments of relative quiet, Titus allowed himself to experience something approaching satisfaction with the knowledge that his service would likely continue for centuries to come. That thought, once terrifying, had become source of purpose. The Emperor's work continued, reality endured, and warriors, marked by doubt yet dedicated to excellence, continued to hold the line against the infinite darkness pressing, against the fragile boundaries of human civilization. This was the legacy of Demetrian Titus, not the elimination of doubt, but its transformation into strength, not the achievement of certainty, but the acceptance that uncertainty could become foundation for unwavering service to purposes greater than individual comprehension. The Eternal Warrior stood ready, as he had stood ready for 4 centuries, as he would stand ready for whatever centuries remained. The fight continued. The end was nowhere visible, and in the continuation itself, in the relentless dedication to duty despite knowing that duty might ultimately be meaningless, the true nature of heroism revealed itself. Not in victory, but in perseverance. Not in certainty, but in faith maintained despite evidence suggesting that faith was unjustified. Not in the individual triumph, but in the service rendered to institutions that transcended any single warrior's lifespan or comprehension. The Red Sun of Tarentus remained in history. The Agri-World child had become an eternal legend, and the saga continued, will continue, must continue, because continuation itself was the highest calling available to those who serve the Emperor of Mankind.